Welcome, dear traveller, to this quiet corner where stories unfold like gentle mist across ancient window panes. I'm here with you tonight to offer something different, a tale designed not to quicken your pulse, but to slow it, to ease the weight of your thoughts, to guide you softly toward peaceful rest. Perhaps you've come seeking refuge from the day's demands, or maybe you simply wish to drift through Victorian shadows and candlelit mysteries as sleep finds you naturally, effortlessly. Tonight's narrative carries you to a snowbound country estate, where mysteries whisper rather than shout, where discovery comes through quiet observation rather than frantic pursuit. This journey invites you to experience the world through the eyes of someone thoughtful, methodical, someone who understands that truth reveals itself to those patient enough to listen. Before we begin, I'm curious. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you nestled beneath warm blankets as winter winds tap at your window? Or perhaps experiencing warmer climates where my voice becomes your only snowfall? Wherever you find yourself, know that this space exists for you, a sanctuary crafted from words and atmosphere. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The evening arrived, draped in that peculiar stillness that precedes heavy snowfall, when the very air seems to hold its breath in anticipation. I sat in my modest London rooms, watching through frost-etched windows as the first delicate flakes began their ancient dance earthward. The fire in my hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting amber light across the worn spines of my books, creating shadows that moved with liquid grace across walls covered in faded damask paper. My name matters little to this tale, though you might consider me a chronicler of curious events, one who has spent years documenting the remarkable investigations of London's most singular consulting detective. On this particular December evening in the year 1891, I found myself alone with my thoughts and a cooling cup of tea, the bergamot fragrance still lingering in the air like a gentle ghost. The clock upon my mantelpiece, an inheritance from my late grandfather, ticked with measured confidence, each sound a small meditation in itself. The brass pendulum caught firelight with every swing, creating tiny constellations that appeared and vanished in endless rhythm. Outside, the snowfall intensified, transforming familiar London streets into something dreamlike, softening harsh edges, muffling the usual cacophony of carriage wheels and distant voices. I had just reached for my notebook, intending to record some observations about the day's meteorological peculiarities, when I heard footsteps ascending the 17 stairs to my door. Not the hurried clatter of urgency, but the deliberate tread of someone carrying both purpose and fatigue in equal measure. A soft knock followed, 3 measured raps that somehow conveyed both courtesy and determination. Rising from my armchair, I crossed the room, feeling the pleasant warmth of the hearthside give way to the cooler air near the entrance. The doorknob felt smooth beneath my palm, worn by decades of countless hands, and as I turned it, the hinges released their familiar whisper of greeting. Before me stood a woman of perhaps 40 years, her travelling cloak dusted heavily with snow that had already begun melting into dark patches upon the fabric. Her face, framed by a hood lined with grey fur, bore the refined features of good breeding, but weariness had etched temporary lines around her eyes that reflected both intelligence and something I could only describe as profound unease. "Dr. Watson?" Her voice carried the cultured tones of England's educated classes, yet trembled slightly, like a violin string held too taut. Forgive this intrusion at such an hour. I sought Mr. Holmes at his new lodgings on Baker Street, but the landlady informed me he departed 3 days hence for a chemical symposium in Edinburgh. She suggested I might find you here, and that you might know how to reach him urgently. I stepped aside, gesturing her into the warmth. Please, come in from the cold. Mr. Holmes is indeed in Scotland, but I maintain telegraph communication. If the matter warrants his immediate attention, I can certainly reach him by morning. She entered gratefully, and I helped her remove the heavy cloak, revealing a travelling dress of deep burgundy wool, practical yet elegant. As I hung the garment near the fire to dry, I observed the fine tremor in her hands. Not from cold, I judged, but from nervous tension held barely in check. Please, sit, I offered, indicating the chair nearest the hearth. Let me prepare fresh tea. You've clearly travelled some distance in increasingly difficult weather. You're very kind, she murmured, settling into the chair with visible relief. I've come from Dartwood Hall in Buckinghamshire, a journey that normally takes 3 hours, but required nearly 6 in these conditions. Every moment I delayed felt like betrayal, yet the snow made haste impossible. I moved to my small spirit kettle, adding fresh water and setting it to heat. The familiar ritual brought its own comfort, measuring tea leaves from the blue porcelain canister, warming the pot with water from the kettle's first boil, the gentle clink of china against china, creating domestic music that seemed to ease some tension from the room. I am Lady Catherine Ashford, she continued, watching the flames with an expression of distant focus. My brother, Lord Edmund Pemberton, sent for me 4 days ago with an urgent telegram. He wrote that something impossible had occurred at his estate, Greymore House, a rather isolated property he inherited 18 months past. His message contained only 3 sentences. Come immediately. Bring no one. Trust no one there. That final phrase particularly disturbs me. The kettle began its quiet song, steam rising in graceful spirals. I poured water over the tea leaves, watching them unfurl like tiny flowers, blooming in accelerated time, releasing their fragrance, a blend of Darjeeling and Assam that I favoured for evening contemplation. When did you last hear from him? I asked gently, allowing the tea to steep while I retrieved 2 cups from the cupboard, their surfaces painted with delicate forget-me-nots, a pattern my late wife had particularly loved. That telegram was the last communication, Lady Catherine replied, her fingers twisting together in her lap. I arrived at Greymore House yesterday evening to find the household in a state of suppressed chaos. The servants moved about their duties with mechanical precision, but their eyes held something I can only describe as dread. My brother's valet, a man named Fletcher, who has served the family for 30 years, met me in the entrance hall and could barely meet my gaze. I poured tea into both cups, the liquid streaming forth in that perfect amber shade that speaks of proper brewing. Steam rose between us, carrying warmth and the promise of small comfort. I added a touch of honey to her cup without asking. She seemed the sort who might appreciate the gentleness it would bring. And Lord Edmund himself, I prompted, settling into the chair opposite hers, cradling my own cup and feeling its heat seep pleasantly into my palms. She accepted the tea with a grateful nod, wrapping both hands around the cup, as though drawing strength from its warmth. Edmund appeared for dinner, looking as though he had aged a decade. He barely touched his food, jumping at every small sound. The settling of floorboards, wind against windows. He told me we would discuss everything in the morning, that he needed to verify one final detail before presenting the full picture. He seemed almost feverish, with some mixture of excitement and terror. The fire crackled softly, a log shifting in the grate and sending up a small constellation of sparks that died like fireflies before reaching the chimney's darkness. Outside, the snow continued its silent accumulation, transforming the world beyond my window into an increasingly abstract landscape of gentle curves and softened angles. This morning, he was gone, Lady Catherine continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. His bed had been slept in, but when Fletcher brought morning tea at 7 o'clock, Edmund was not in his chambers. We searched the house, every room, every closet, the cellars, the attics. Nothing. No note, no sign of departure. His winter coat remained hanging in his wardrobe. His boots stood beside his bed. Yet he had vanished as completely as morning mist beneath sunlight. She paused to sip her tea, and I observed the way the cup trembled slightly as she raised it to her lips. The honey and warmth seemed to steady her somewhat, bringing a faint colour back to cheeks that had been pale as the snow outside. The household staff claims to have heard nothing unusual, seen nothing amiss. The night footman swears no doors or windows were opened after the house was locked at 11. Yet somehow, impossibly, my brother departed a sealed house in the depths of night without coat or boots, leaving no trace of his passage during a snowstorm that left pristine drifts all around the estate. Drifts bearing no footprints whatsoever. I set down my cup with deliberate care, my mind already turning over the curious details of her account. You mentioned he inherited this property 18 months ago. Do you know its history? Why he chose to reside there? Lady Catherine's expression grew thoughtful, her gaze distant. Greymore House has stood for nearly 3 centuries, built by a branch of the Pemberton family that pursued rather eccentric interests. The last occupant before Edmund was our great-uncle, Nathaniel Pemberton, a scholar of medieval history and antiquarian studies. He died at age 87, having lived alone there for 40 years with only a handful of servants. Edmund was his closest living relative and inherited everything: the house, the grounds, and Uncle Nathaniel's rather extensive library. "And what drew your brother to take up residence there?" I asked, noting how the question seemed to touch something she had been reluctant to address directly. She drew a slow breath, her fingers resuming their anxious movement. Edmund always possessed scholarly inclinations. He studied history at Cambridge, though family obligations required him to manage our father's business interests in London. When Uncle Nathaniel died and left him Greymore, Edmund saw an opportunity to finally pursue intellectual passions he had long suppressed. He spoke of cataloguing our great-uncle's collection, of writing a comprehensive history of the estate and the region. He seemed genuinely happy for the first time in years. The clock marked the passing of another quarter hour, its chime gentle and contemplative. I rose to add another log to the fire, selecting a piece of applewood that would burn with particular sweetness. As I positioned it carefully among the glowing coals, I heard the soft catch in Lady Catherine's breathing that suggested she struggled against tears. "What aren't you telling me?" I asked gently, returning to my seat. "Forgive my directness, but I sense there are details you're reluctant to share, perhaps things that seem too strange." too impossible to speak aloud. She looked at me then with an expression of profound relief mixed with apprehension, as though I had given permission for something she desperately needed to voice, but feared would sound like madness. The morning before Edmund vanished, she began slowly, I rose early and came upon him in Uncle Nathaniel's library. He didn't hear me approach. He was utterly absorbed in a leather-bound journal, quite ancient by the look of it. His hands shook as he turned the pages, and I heard him murmur something that made no sense. They were right. God help me, they were actually right. The fire popped softly, the new log catching and beginning to release its stored sunlight in the form of dancing flames. Shadows moved across the walls like silent witnesses to her testimony. When he realized I was there, he closed the journal quickly, too quickly, as though caught in something shameful. He tried to smile, to make light conversation about breakfast, but his eyes kept darting back to the book, now hidden beneath some papers on the desk. I asked him directly what he'd discovered, what had so disturbed him. He took both my hands and said, "Catherine, our family history is not what we believed. Our great-uncle left documentation of events that challenge every rational assumption I've ever held. I must verify what I'm reading before I can discuss it. Give me 2 days. If I'm right, it explains certain phenomena at Greymore, phenomena I've been too embarrassed to mention to anyone." I leaned forward slightly, drawn by the narrative despite my conscious intention to maintain professional detachment. What phenomena had he observed? Lady Catherine set down her teacup, the gentle clink of china against wood seeming loud in the quiet room. He mentioned sounds at night, not the ordinary settling of an old house, but rhythmic patterns, almost like footsteps in rooms he knew to be empty. He spoke of finding doors open that he distinctly remembered locking, books in the library that appeared to rearrange themselves overnight. He laughed when describing these things, made light of them, called himself a superstitious fool. But beneath the laughter, I heard genuine unease. "Did you attempt to examine this journal after your brother's disappearance?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "I returned to the library this afternoon and searched for it among the papers where he'd hidden it. The journal was gone. In fact, I found a space on one of the shelves. You know how books leave outlines in the dust. Where several volumes had clearly stood but were now missing. Someone had removed them, whether it was Edmund himself before he vanished, or someone else, I cannot say." I stood and moved to the window, looking out at the transformed cityscape. The snowfall showed no signs of abating. If anything, it had intensified, driven now by wind that sent flakes swirling in complex patterns against the darkness. The streets below had grown silent, as London only becomes when winter truly asserts its dominance. "Lady Catherine," I said, still watching the snow, "I cannot promise the immediate attendance of Mr. Holmes. Telegraph communication with Edinburgh would reach him by tomorrow, but his return would take at minimum 2 days in good conditions, possibly 4 in weather like this. However, I can offer my own assistance, imperfect as it may be compared to his remarkable faculties. I have accompanied him on sufficient investigations to have absorbed certain methods of observation and deduction." I turned to face her, finding her looking at me with an expression of desperate hope. "Would you permit me to accompany you to Greymore House? I have some experience with household mysteries and missing persons, and at very least I can conduct a preliminary investigation until Holmes himself can attend to the matter. Dr. Watson, she breathed, I would be profoundly grateful. I must return tomorrow regardless. I cannot abandon the servants to their fear, and I refuse to give up searching for Edmund. To have someone accompanying me, someone with experience in such matters, would be an enormous comfort. We made our arrangements then. I would prepare for several days' absence. She would take a room at a nearby hotel for the night, and we would depart on the 10 o'clock train from Marylebone Station, assuming the rail lines remained passable. She left shortly thereafter, seeming stronger for having shared her burden, the snow in her wake swirling through my doorway, like eager spirits, before I closed it against the winter night. After she departed, I stood for some time at my desk, composing a telegram to Holmes in Edinburgh. The familiar discipline of precise language helped organize my thoughts. Client seeks your assistance for disappearance from locked house during snowstorm. Lord Edmund Pemberton, Greymore House, Bucks. Sister Lady Catherine Ashford reports strange phenomena preceding vanishing. Will proceed to cite in your stead unless you wire contrary instruction. Watson. Having arranged for the telegram's dispatch first thing in the morning, I began preparations for the journey. From my wardrobe, I selected practical travelling clothes, heavy wool trousers, a warm waistcoat, sturdy boots, appropriate for countryside navigation. I packed my medical bag by long-standing habit, though I couldn't say what ailment I expected to treat. Into a larger valise, I placed notebooks, pencils, a magnifying glass Holmes had once given me, and several other items I had learned might prove useful in investigative work. The snow continued throughout the night, and I slept only intermittently, my mind turning over the curious details of Lady Catherine's account. Each time I woke, I rose to peer out to the window, watching the accumulation transform familiar London into something from a fairy tale, beautiful and vaguely threatening in its relentless obliteration of the ordinary world. Morning arrived, not with bright sun, but with that peculiar grey-white luminescence that indicates heavy cloud cover and continued snowfall. I took breakfast quickly, toast and strong tea, the necessary fuel for body and mind. Then gathered my belongings and made my way through streets transformed into narrow canyons between walls of shoveled snow. The railway station bustled with controlled chaos, travellers anxious about delays and cancellations, porters moving luggage with determined efficiency, the great locomotives breathing steam into the cold air like patient dragons awaiting their moment of fire and motion. I found Lady Catherine on the platform precisely at the arranged time, looking more composed than she had the previous evening, her travelling costume practical, and her expression resolute. The lines remain open, at least as far as Wendover, she reported as I approached. Beyond that, conditions are apparently uncertain, but the station master assures me we should reach Ashford Bridge Station by early afternoon. We secured a private compartment, and soon the train lurched into motion with that peculiar series of jerks and adjustments that precedes smooth travel. As London's outskirts gave way to snow-covered countryside, I settled into my seat and withdrew my notebook, intending to record everything Lady Catherine could tell me about Greymore House, its inhabitants, and the days preceding her brother's disappearance. The rhythm of the train created its own hypnotic music, wheels clacking over rail joints, the occasional whistle announcing our passage through small stations, the subtle swaying that made the compartment feel like a small ship navigating gentle seas. Through the window, the landscape unfolded in muted tones. White fields, interrupted by dark lines of hedgerows and stone walls. Occasional farmhouses sending up grey smoke from chimneys. Stands of winter trees holding snow in their bare branches like precious cargo. "Tell me about the household at Greymore," I requested, pencil poised above paper. "Who resides there permanently, and what are their roles?" Lady Catherine gazed out the window as she organised her thoughts, her breath creating faint fog on the cold glass. "The permanent staff is quite small. Mrs. Holloway serves as housekeeper, a widow of perhaps 55, supremely competent, has managed the household for my Uncle Nathaniel for the past 20 years. Edmund retained her services and relies heavily upon her knowledge of the estate's workings." I made careful notes as she continued, appreciating the detail she provided. "Fletcher, as I mentioned, is my brother's valet, and has been with our family for decades. He followed Edmund to Greymore out of loyalty. There's also Thomas, the butler, rather elderly now, near 70, I should think, but precise in his duties. A young man named Peter serves as footman and general assistant. 2 daily maids come from the village, the Mrs. Sarah and Martha Wickham, sisters who return to their cottage each evening. And the household runs smoothly under this arrangement?" I asked, noting the relatively modest staff for what sounded like a substantial property. "Greymore is not so large as to require extensive staff," she explained. "Perhaps 15 rooms in total, many closed off, since they're unnecessary for one gentleman living quietly. Edmund kept the library, study, dining room, morning room, and his private chambers in use. The rest remains under dustcloths, visited only for periodic cleaning." The train passed through a small village, a handful of cottages clustered around a stone church, smoke rising from chimneys in vertical lines that spoke of still air despite the snow. A few villagers paused in their shoveling to watch our passage, their figures looking small and isolated against the vast white landscape. "Has your brother formed any connections in the local area?" I inquired. "Friendships, scholarly associations, anything that might provide insight into his state of mind." Lady Catherine considered this carefully. "He mentioned corresponding with a vicar in the neighbouring parish, a Reverend Blackwood, regarding local history and church records. Edmund spoke highly of the man's knowledge and his access to documents dating back centuries. There's also a local doctor, Dr. Thornton, who attended Edmund for a minor respiratory complaint last autumn. I believe they spoke at some length during that visit. Edmund said the doctor had an interesting mind and some knowledge of the estate's history. I'd like to understand more about your great-uncle Nathaniel," I said, looking up from my notes. "What manner of man was he? What drove his scholarly interests?" A faint smile touched Lady Catherine's lips, though sadness tinged it. "I met him only a handful of times. He rarely left Greymore, and our family visited infrequently. He seemed kind enough, but profoundly distracted, as though his mind constantly dwelt elsewhere. His passion was medieval history, particularly the period of the Crusades and the various orders of knights that emerged from them. His library contains thousands of volumes on the subject, including quite rare manuscripts and documents he collected throughout his life." She paused, reaching into her reticule to withdraw a handkerchief, though she seemed to be holding tears at bay rather than surrendering to them. Uncle Nathaniel believed that much of official history was incomplete, that significant events and organizations had been deliberately obscured or forgotten. Edmund said he used to speak of the hidden streams of history, the currents that moved beneath recorded events, shaping outcomes in ways contemporary chroniclers never understood or chose not to document. Outside, the snow had intensified again, reducing visibility and giving our journey through it an increasingly dreamlike quality, as though we travelled not through physical space, but through some liminal realm between the solid world and something less certain. The compartment's warmth, combined with the rhythmic motion and the soft sounds of the train, created an atmosphere conducive to contemplation, to the slow unfolding of thoughts and memories. Did Edmund share his uncle's interests? I asked. Or did he come to them only after inheriting the collection? Something of both, I think, she replied, her voice taking on that soft, reflective quality of someone examining memories for new meaning. As a young man, Edmund loved medieval romance, tales of Arthur, of Charlemagne and his paladins, the legends of the Grail. Our father dismissed these as childish fancy, insisted Edmund focus on practical matters of business and estate management. When Edmund inherited Greymoor, it was as though he'd been given permission to return to abandoned passions. The train began to slow, and I leaned toward the window to observe a small station emerging from the snow. Wendover, according to the sign barely visible through the accumulation. We stopped there for nearly 20 minutes, while the crew attended to some mechanical adjustment, and I took the opportunity to walk the platform, stretching legs cramped by sitting and taking in lungfuls of the sharp, cold air. The station was largely deserted, just a single clerk huddled in the small waiting room near a struggling stove. The village beyond was barely visible through the snow, a few dim shapes suggesting buildings and streets. Everything felt muffled, sounds absorbed by the heavy snow, creating that peculiar silence that is not absence of noise, but rather a presence in itself, something you can almost touch. When we resumed our journey, Lady Catherine had procured tea from a station vendor, weak and rather bitter, but hot, served in thick ceramic cups that retained warmth admirably. We sipped in companionable silence for a time, watching the landscape continue its white uniformity, the occasional tree or building serving as punctuation in an otherwise unbroken sentence of snow. "There's something else," Lady Catherine said eventually, her voice quiet enough that I had to lean forward slightly to hear over the train's sounds. "The night before Edmund vanished, I woke sometime after midnight. I'm uncertain of the exact hour. I heard what I thought was music, very faint, almost at the edge of hearing. It seemed to come from somewhere deep within the house, perhaps from beneath it. Music," I prompted gently. "Can you describe it?" She frowned, clearly trying to recapture an elusive memory. Nothing recognizable as a tune, but rhythmic, like chanting perhaps, or very low singing. It made me feel strange, not frightened exactly, but unsettled, as though I'd heard something not meant for me. I put on my dressing gown and opened my door, intending to investigate, but the sound stopped immediately. I waited several minutes in the corridor, listening, but heard only the normal night sounds of an old house, distant settling, wind against windows. "Did you mention this to your brother?" "I intended to at breakfast, but he looked so dreadful, so exhausted, that I thought better of adding to his concerns. I told myself I'd imagined it, or perhaps heard wind in the chimneys creating peculiar acoustics." She looked at me directly, her eyes searching my face for signs of skepticism. "But I didn't imagine it, Dr. Watson. I know what I heard, even if I cannot explain it. I believe you, I assured her, and I meant it sincerely. In my years with Holmes, I had learned that witnesses who speak with such specific uncertainty, acknowledging the strangeness of their experience while maintaining its reality, generally prove reliable. Those who invent or exaggerate typically present their testimony with false certainty, lacking the honest doubt that accompanies genuine, mysterious experience. The afternoon was well advanced by the time we finally pulled into Ashford Bridge Station, a small rural stop consisting of little more than a single platform and a modest building housing a station master's office and waiting room. The snow had eased somewhat, though the sky remained heavy with the promise of more, and the cold struck like a physical blow as we descended from our compartment's relative warmth. A carriage awaited us. Lady Catherine had telegraphed ahead, and I helped load our luggage while she spoke briefly with the driver, an older man whose weathered face suggested a lifetime in outdoor service. His expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught something in his eyes when he spoke to Lady Catherine, a mixture of sympathy and unease that told me the household's troubles had spread beyond Greymoor's walls. The drive from the station took nearly 45 minutes, following narrow lanes where the snow had been only partially cleared, creating ruts and drifts that slowed our progress. On either side, fields stretched away into gathering dimness, the occasional stone wall or hedgerow providing the only variation in the landscape. We passed through one small hamlet, a dozen cottages, a pub, a church, where warm light glowed in windows like promises of comfort and normalcy. The countryside here possessed a particular character, a sense of age and persistent memory that even winter's obliteration couldn't entirely erase. This was ancient land, I realized, settled for millennia, its contours shaped not just by geology, but by countless generations of human labor and habitation. Stone walls followed property lines established before written records. Footpaths traced routes, trod smooth by centuries of feet. As we travelled, full darkness descended, and the carriage lamps became small islands of light in a sea of winter night. The snow had stopped entirely now, and through breaks in the clouds, I glimpsed stars, brilliant points that seemed impossibly distant and indifferent to human concerns. Not much farther, Lady Catherine murmured, peering through the window. The estate begins just beyond that copse of trees ahead. Indeed, as we rounded a gentle curve, stone pillars emerged from the darkness, marking the entrance to a long drive. The carriage turned between them, and I observed the remnants of an iron gate, long since removed, leaving only the massive hinges embedded in stone. The drive itself stretched ahead, lined with ancient oaks whose bare branches created a tunnel-like effect, their twisting forms barely visible in the lamplight. The house announced itself gradually, first a dimly perceived mass darker than the surrounding night, then individual windows glowing with lamplight, finally resolving into a 3-story structure of grey stone, its architecture speaking of different periods of construction. The original building appeared Tudor in origin, with later additions in Georgian style, creating an asymmetrical but oddly harmonious whole. We drew to a halt before the main entrance, where carved stone steps led up to heavy wooden doors that looked capable of withstanding siege. As the driver set about unloading our luggage, those doors opened, revealing an elderly man in impeccable butler's attire. Thomas, I presumed, holding a lamp that cast his lined face in dramatic relief. "Lady Catherine," he intoned, his voice carrying both welcome and something heavier, perhaps dread at what news he might have to impart. "Dr. Watson, please, come in from the cold. Mrs. Holloway has prepared rooms and a late supper for you both." We crossed the threshold into an entrance hall that immediately conveyed the house's age and character. The floor consisted of great flagstones, worn smooth by centuries of passage, partially covered by Persian carpets, whose colours had mellowed to gentle harmonies. A wide staircase of dark oak rose to the upper floors, its banister polished by countless hands. Portraits hung on panelled walls, generations of Pembertons regarding the present with expressions ranging from stern judgment to benign interest. But it was the atmosphere that struck me most forcefully, not threatening precisely, but heavy, weighted with history and recent events. The house felt watchful, as though it possessed awareness and memory, as though the stones themselves had absorbed something of all they had witnessed. A handsome woman of middle years emerged from a side corridor, her housekeeper's keys jingling softly at her waist. Mrs. Holloway, certainly, her bearing suggesting both competence and carefully controlled worry. "My lady," she said, offering a slight curtsy. "Doctor, I've prepared the rose room for Lady Catherine and the green room for Dr. Watson. They're both in the east wing, near Lord Edmund's chambers. I thought you might wish to be close to, in case." Her composure wavered slightly, and Lady Catherine reached out to touch her arm gently. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. You've done well. Has there been any change? Any sign?" The housekeeper shook her head slowly, her eyes reflecting pain and bewilderment. "Nothing, my lady. We've searched again today. Every inch of the house, and as much of the grounds as the snow permits. It's as though he simply ceased to be." "Then we shall search again tomorrow in daylight," I said firmly, attempting to project confidence and method into the heavy atmosphere. For now, if we might warm ourselves and take some refreshment, the journey was long and rather cold. Mrs. Holloway seemed grateful for practical direction. "Of course, Doctor. Thomas will show you to your rooms. I'll have supper sent up in half an hour. Something warm and restorative. The library fire is laid if you wish to gather there afterward. Lord Edmund's study as well, though." She hesitated. "Forgive me, but nothing in either room has been disturbed since his disappearance. I thought perhaps you might wish to examine them as they were." "Very thoughtful," I assured her. "Please, let's maintain everything exactly as it was. And I'd like to speak with all members of the household tomorrow morning. Brief interviews, nothing alarming, simply gathering information." Thomas led us up the grand staircase, our footsteps muffled by a long carpet runner in deep crimson. The walls here bore more portraits and several landscape paintings depicting the estate in various seasons. Brass gas fixtures provided steady light, their mantles hissing softly, casting a warm glow that nonetheless seemed unable to fully banish the shadows, gathering in corners and recesses. The east wing corridor stretched away into dimness, doors lining both sides. Thomas indicated which rooms were ours, then showed us to mine first, the green room, named for the colour of its wallpaper, a William Morris pattern of stylized leaves and flowers that created the impression of a garden frozen in decorative permanence. The room itself welcomed with genuine comfort, a substantial bed with dark wood frame and green velvet hangings, a writing desk positioned near tall windows, currently curtained against the night, 2 armchairs flanking a small fireplace where coal burned with steady warmth, My luggage had already been brought up and placed near the wardrobe. "Ring if you require anything, sir," Thomas said, indicating the bell pull beside the bed. "Supper will arrive shortly. Lady Catherine is just 3 doors down, and Lord Edmund's chambers are between you, the door with the carved linen-fold panelling." After he departed, I stood for a moment in the centre of the room, listening to the house around me. Old buildings possess their own vocabulary of sounds. The subtle settling of timbers, the whisper of air through floorboards, the distant tick of clocks, marking time's patient passage. But beneath these ordinary noises, I detected something else, though I couldn't quite identify it. A quality of stillness that seemed too complete, as though the house held its breath. I unpacked methodically, hanging clothes in the wardrobe, placing personal items on the dresser, setting my notebook and pencils on the writing desk. The familiar actions brought a sense of order and normalcy. I washed my hands and face in the basin provided, the water cold but refreshing, then settled into one of the armchairs to wait for supper and collect my thoughts. The fire crackled companionably, its light dancing across the ceiling and creating moving shadows that might, if one were inclined toward fancy, suggest figures and faces in their constant transformations. Through the windows, though curtained, I could hear wind beginning to rise, sighing around the house's corners and eaves. True to Mrs. Holloway's word, a soft knock announced supper's arrival precisely 30 minutes later. A young man entered, Peter, the footman, carrying a tray laden with covered dishes. He couldn't have been more than 20, with a frank, open face currently clouded by worry. "Your supper, sir," he said, setting the tray on a small table. Mrs. Holloway prepared lamb stew, fresh bread, and apple tart. There's a pot of tea as well, and a decanter of brandy if you prefer something stronger against the cold. "This looks wonderful," I assured him. And indeed, the aromas rising from the dishes made me suddenly aware of genuine hunger. "Peter, isn't it? I understand you've been here throughout Lord Edmund's residence. It must be a difficult time for the household." The young man's face reflected relief at being addressed directly. "Terrible difficult, sir. His lordship was always kind, always fair. None of us can understand what's happened. It's like a nightmare we can't wake from." "I'm here to help discover the truth," I told him gently. "I'll want to speak with you tomorrow. Nothing to fear, simply hearing what you might have observed or heard. Fresh eyes and ears often notice things that have become too familiar to those living daily with them." He nodded eagerly. "I'll tell you anything I can, sir. We all will. We just want Lord Edmund found safe." After he left, I lifted the covers from the dishes to find exactly what had been promised: a rich stew with tender meat and vegetables in savoury gravy, bread still warm from the oven, and a generous slice of apple tart with a flaky crust that spoke of expert pastry work. I ate slowly, savouring both the food and the simple domestic comfort it represented. The tea was strong and hot, exactly what the evening required. As I sipped it, I found my mind reviewing the day's information, trying to organize facts and impressions into some coherent pattern. A man had vanished from a locked house during a snowstorm, leaving no footprints in fresh snow. Before disappearing, he had discovered something in old journals that both excited and terrified him. The house had a history of scholarly research into medieval mysteries and possibly secret societies. On the surface, several explanations suggested themselves. Edmund had staged his own disappearance for unknown reasons. He had met with foul play from someone inside the household. He had succumbed to some form of mental breakdown and wandered into the night in a confused state, somehow evading notice. Or, least likely, but impossible to dismiss entirely, something genuinely inexplicable had occurred. Holmes would counsel me to eliminate the impossible, then trust whatever remained, however improbable. Very well. First, I needed to establish facts, the exact timeline of Edmund's last known movements, the household's precise location and activities during the critical hours, the actual state of the house's security, and a thorough search for any physical evidence. Footprints, disturbances, anything that might indicate method or direction. I had nearly finished my meal when another soft knock drew my attention. "Come in," I called, and Lady Catherine entered, having changed from her travelling clothes into a dark blue tea gown, her hair arranged simply. She looked both weary and determined. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. "I thought we might examine Edmund's rooms before retiring. I find I cannot rest without at least beginning the investigation." I collected my materials, and together we stepped into the corridor, now dimly lit by gas fixtures turned low for the night. The wind outside had intensified, and I could hear it testing the house's defences, finding every small gap and singing through them in various tones. Lord Edmund's door stood between our rooms, its carved panels depicting intricate foliate designs that spoke of Tudor craftsmanship. Lady Catherine tried the handle and found it unlocked. Mrs. Holloway had apparently prepared it for our inspection. The door swung inward with a faint creak, revealing chambers that immediately conveyed both their occupant's character and the disturbing fact of his absence. The rooms consisted of a bedroom and an adjoining sitting room, both furnished with pieces that ranged from Jacobean to modern. Everything maintained perfect order, no signs of struggle or hurried departure. The bedroom held a substantial four-poster bed, its coverings pulled back and partially disturbed, showing where Edmund had indeed slept. A nightshirt lay across a chair near the bed, alongside the dressing gown he had apparently worn earlier. The boots Lady Catherine had mentioned stood precisely beside the bed, positioned as though their owner had just stepped out of them. I examined them closely. Good quality leather, well maintained, their soles showing normal wear, but nothing unusual. More significantly, they were completely dry, showing no signs of contact with snow, or even significant moisture. If Edmund had left the house, he had not done so wearing these boots. A wardrobe against one wall held his clothing, all neatly arranged. I noted with interest that his heavy winter coat remained hanging there, as Lady Catherine had reported. Other outdoor clothing, a lighter coat, a waterproof cloak, also hung undisturbed. Drawers contained precisely folded shirts, undergarments, stockings, all in perfect order. The dressing table held the usual masculine toilet articles: brushes, a razor and shaving equipment, cologne water, hair oil. Everything positioned with almost military precision, suggesting Edmund maintained orderly habits. A pocket watch sat in a small dish, its chain coiled beside it. "He never went anywhere without that watch," Lady Catherine murmured, seeing where my attention had fixed. "Our father gave it to him on his 21st birthday. Edmund always kept it, either on his person or precisely there on the dressing table. That he left it behind suggests he departed unexpectedly, without time to perform his usual preparations." The sitting room adjoined through an open doorway. This space clearly served as a private study and retreat, Two walls bore floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, mostly filled with volumes on history, medieval studies, architectural works, and antiquarian subjects. A comfortable leather armchair sat near the fireplace, positioned to catch both firelight and lamplight, with a small side table holding a reading lamp and a half-empty glass of what appeared to be whiskey. A writing desk occupied the space beneath the window, and here I found the first truly intriguing evidence. Papers lay scattered across its surface in apparent disorder, quite at odds with the meticulous organization evident everywhere else. Several books lay open, their pages marked with slips of paper. A blotter showed ink stains, suggesting recent, possibly hurried writing. I approached carefully, not wanting to disturb anything until I had documented its original state. Lady Catherine produced a small box of matches and lit the lamp on the desk, flooding the area with steady light that revealed details previously obscured. The open books proved to be historical texts concerning the Knights Templar, with particular focus on their suppression and dissolution in the 14th century. Passages had been marked with pencil, neat, precise annotations in what I presumed was Edmund's hand. The notations referenced other sources, page numbers, cross-references to documents he had apparently examined. The scattered papers included notes in Edmund's handwriting. I confirmed this with Lady Catherine, covering multiple topics, but returning repeatedly to certain themes: secret societies, hidden knowledge, ritual practices, and something he referred to as the legacy, in capitals that suggested specific meaning beyond the word's general sense. One sheet in particular caught my attention. It contained what appeared to be a list of dates and brief descriptions. 1314. Dissolution commenced 1647. Documents hidden at G. 1582. Uncle Nathaniel's research begins 1743. Final contact recorded 1889. The journal found 1892. Verification required. That final entry, 1892, referred to the current year, just weeks away in the calendar. The word verification had been underlined 3 times, suggesting urgency or importance. Beneath this list, Edmund had written in larger script, "If Uncle N was correct, then the chamber must still exist. But where? The plans show nothing. Ask Fletcher about the oldest cellars." "Do you know what chamber he might have meant?" I asked Lady Catherine, who stood reading over my shoulder. She shook her head slowly. "No, but perhaps Mrs. Holloway would know. She managed the house for Uncle Nathaniel for 2 decades. If there are unusual features, hidden spaces, she would likely be aware of them." I carefully copied everything from Edmund's notes into my own notebook, preserving the exact wording and arrangement. While doing so, I noticed something else: a small wooden box on the corner of the desk, its lid slightly ajar. Inside, I found a collection of objects that seemed significant, though their meaning remained obscure. An old key, heavy and ornate, its design suggesting great age. Several sealing wax impressions on paper, showing complex symbols I didn't recognize. A fragment of parchment bearing Latin text in medieval script, and a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be coins or medallions. "May I?" I asked, indicating the objects, and Lady Catherine nodded her assent. I lifted the key first, feeling its substantial weight, examining the elaborate bit with its complex pattern of cuts and wards. This was no ordinary house key, but something designed for a specific, possibly unique lock. The metal had darkened with age, but showed signs of recent cleaning in some areas, as though someone had been examining and handling it frequently. The wax impressions depicted identical symbols, a cross of peculiar design, with additional elements that might have been letters or abstract decorative features. I carefully sketched one in my notebook for later reference. The parchment fragment was too fragile to handle extensively, but I could make out several words of the Latin text: custodium, veritas, sub terra. The words suggested guarding, truth, and beneath the earth, tantalizing fragments that hinted at hidden things and protective secrecy. The medallions in the leather pouch bore similar symbols to those on the wax impressions, clearly connected, part of some coherent system of meaning that remained opaque to me without additional context. "Your great-uncle collected these items?" I asked. "I assume so," Lady Catherine replied. "Edmund never mentioned them to me specifically, but Uncle Nathaniel accumulated hundreds of such artifacts during his researches. The entire library and several rooms on the 3rd floor contain his collections." A thought occurred to me. These rooms, the 3rd floor, might we examine them? She hesitated. "I've been told the 3rd floor is largely inaccessible. Many rooms locked, others filled with crates and stored materials. Edmund intended to catalogue everything eventually, but hadn't yet begun the work. Mrs. Holloway would have keys, I imagine." I made a note to explore the 3rd floor tomorrow. If Uncle Nathaniel had devoted his life to researching hidden history and secret societies, his collected materials might hold crucial information about what Edmund had discovered and what might have led to his disappearance. We continued our examination of Edmund's rooms for another half-hour, but found nothing else of immediate significance. The bedroom and sitting room revealed a man of scholarly bent, orderly habits, and increasing obsession with particular historical mysteries, but they offered no clear indication of how he had vanished from a locked house into a snowstorm without leaving trace or track. As we prepared to depart, I noticed something that had previously escaped my attention: a faint scent in the air, barely perceptible beneath the normal aromas of a long-occupied room. It was vaguely sweet, almost like incense, or some variety of exotic fragrance. I mentioned it to Lady Catherine. She breathed deeply, concentrating. "Yes, I smell it too. How odd. Edmund never used scents. He found them distracting. Perhaps it comes from elsewhere in the house." "Perhaps," I agreed, though I made note of it in my book. In Holmes's methods, seemingly trivial details often proved crucial. The mind automatically filters and discards most sensory information. Training oneself to notice and record everything creates a database from which patterns might later emerge. We bid each other good night in the corridor, Lady Catherine looking somewhat reassured by our systematic beginning to the investigation, though I could see the worry still weighing heavily upon her. She disappeared into her own room, and I heard the soft click of the lock, understandable given the circumstances. I returned to the green room, where the fire had burned lower, but still provided warmth and comfortable light. The wind outside had grown more insistent, no longer merely sighing, but occasionally moaning, like a distant voice expressing wordless sorrow. Snow had evidently resumed. I could hear it hissing against the window glass like urgent whispers. I prepared for bed methodically, changing into nightclothes and performing the automatic rituals of evening ablution. Yet I found myself restless, my mind too active for immediate sleep. I sat in the armchair near the dying fire, reviewing my notes by lamplight, trying to see patterns in the accumulating information. The evidence suggested Edmund had been pursuing some specific investigation, related to his great-uncle's research. Something about a chamber, about verification of historical claims. His emotional state before the disappearance indicated he had made a significant discovery, something that excited and disturbed him. The mysterious sounds Lady Catherine had heard suggested possible nocturnal activities, either by Edmund himself or by others. The complete absence of footprints in the snow surrounding the house argued strongly that he'd not departed through any normal exit. This left limited possibilities. He remained somewhere within the house, alive or dead, in a location not yet discovered. He had departed before the snow fell, earlier than anyone had realized. Someone had concealed or removed evidence of his departure, or the situation involved something I was not yet prepared to conceive. I added coal to the fire, building it up against the night's cold. The fresh fuel caught quickly, flames rising with renewed vigor, casting dancing light that transformed the room into a space of shifting boundaries between illumination and darkness. In such an atmosphere, it was easy to understand how minds might turn towards supernatural explanations. Ancient houses, mysterious disappearances, hidden histories, all conspire to suggest forces beyond normal comprehension. A sound from the corridor drew my attention. Footsteps, slow and measured, approaching along the hallway. They paused outside my door, and for a moment I held my breath, listening. Then they resumed, moving past toward the far end of the corridor before descending the stairs. The night footman making his rounds, most likely. Or perhaps Mrs. Holloway, checking that all was secure. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed midnight, 12 measured strokes that seemed to acknowledge some threshold between the day that had been and whatever the coming hours might bring. I finally surrendered to my fatigue, turning down the lamp and climbing into the bed, finding it comfortable and well made. Yet sleep, when it came uneasily. I found myself in that liminal state between waking and true rest, aware of the room around me, while simultaneously experiencing fragmentary dreams. Endless corridors leading deeper into darkness, voices chanting in languages I couldn't identify. The sensation of searching for something crucial, while time slipped irretrievably away. At some point, I could not have said when, I became aware of sound beneath or behind the normal night sounds of the house. It was rhythmic, almost musical, exactly as Lady Catherine had described. Not quite chanting, not quite singing, but something partaking of both, coming from somewhere distant, yet somehow present, as though transmitted through the very stones of the building. I sat up in bed, fully awake now, listening intently. The sound persisted for perhaps 30 seconds, then ceased as abruptly as it had begun. I struck a match and lit the candle beside my bed, then rose and went to the door, opening it carefully to peer into the corridor. The hallway stretched away in darkness, illuminated only by a single gas fixture burning low at the far end. Nothing moved, no sounds disturbed the silence. I considered investigating further, but recognized the futility of searching in darkness without better knowledge of the house's layout and the source of the sounds. Instead, I returned to bed, but left the candle burning low on the nightstand, a small beacon against the pressing dark. I lay awake for some time, listening, but the strange sounds did not return. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, pulling me down into deeper sleep, where dreams, if any came, left no memory upon waking. Morning arrived grey and still, the kind of winter daylight that seems less like presence than absence of night. I woke to the sound of someone moving quietly in the corridor. The maid, probably, attending to early morning duties. The fire in my room had died entirely, leaving the air noticeably cold. I rose quickly, washed in water, now ice cold in the basin, and dressed in layers appropriate for exploring a winter estate. As I did so, I reviewed my priorities for the day. Interview all household members. Search the grounds for any evidence the snow might have concealed. Examine the library where Edmund had spent so much time. And if possible, gain access to the third-floor collections. A knock at my door announced the arrival of breakfast. Young Peter again, looking somewhat more rested than the previous evening, bearing a tray with porridge, toast, eggs, bacon, and a pot of strong tea. "Good morning, sir," he said, with an attempt at cheerfulness. "Mrs. Holloway said to tell you the household is assembled in the servants' hall when you're ready to speak with them. Lady Catherine is already up. She's taking breakfast in the morning room." "Excellent," I replied, accepting the tray. "Please inform them I'll come down in half an hour, after I've eaten and gathered my notes." The breakfast fortified me admirably, and I felt considerably more prepared to face the day's challenges. As I ate, I reviewed my notebook, organizing questions I wanted to ask each member of the household. True to my word, I descended 30 minutes later, guided by Peter to the servants' hall, a comfortable space in the rear of the house, where the staff took their meals and enjoyed their limited leisure. The room was warm from the large range used for cooking, and pleasantly filled with the scents of baking bread and whatever preparations were underway for the day's meals. The household staff assembled there presented a study in controlled anxiety. Mrs. Holloway sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed, but her eyes reflecting deep concern. Fletcher, the valet, stood near the fire, a man of perhaps 60, with silver hair and the bearing of one who had spent a lifetime in distinguished service. Thomas, the elderly butler, occupied a chair near the window, his gnarled hands resting on a walking stick. Peter stood near the door, and two young women, the Wickham sisters, I presumed, sat together on a bench, their similar features marking them clearly as siblings. I addressed them collectively first, trying to project calm authority. "Thank you all for gathering. I know this is a distressing time, but I hope that by working together, we can discover what has happened to Lord Edmund. I'm going to speak with each of you individually. Nothing formal or intimidating, simply collecting information about what you've observed, heard, or experienced. Even details that seem trivial or unrelated may prove important." Mrs. Holloway nodded approvingly. "We're all eager to help in any way possible, Dr. Watson. Lord Edmund is a good master, and we're desperately worried for his safety." I spoke with each of them in turn, using a small sitting room off the servants' hall to provide privacy. I began with Mrs. Holloway, whose long tenure at Greymore made her knowledge invaluable. She settled into a chair with the careful precision of someone who bore responsibility and felt its weight keenly. "Where should I begin, Doctor?" "Tell me about the house itself," I requested. "Its layout, any unusual features, hidden spaces, anything that might help me understand how someone could seemingly vanish from within it." She considered this carefully. Greymore has stood for nearly 3 centuries, with additions and modifications in each generation. The oldest portion, the central block, dates to Queen Elizabeth's time. The east and west wings were added in the Georgian period, and Uncle Nathaniel commissioned some modernization about 30 years ago, installing gas lighting and improved plumbing. Extensive ones, sir. Several levels, actually. The uppermost contains the wine cellar, storage for preserved foods, that sort of practical space. Below that lies older construction, medieval stonework, quite rough. Uncle Nathaniel used those lower areas for storing his collections and documents. How many entrances to these cellars? This struck me as highly significant. This tunnel, do you know where it emerges? Whether it's still passable? I'm afraid I don't, sir. Uncle Nathaniel was vague about it, and I got the impression he himself had never actually located its outer opening. He said it might have collapsed decades or centuries ago. Has anyone searched these lower cellars since Lord Edmund's disappearance? Only briefly, sir. Thomas went down the morning we discovered Lord Edmund missing, but the lower levels are quite extensive. Multiple chambers and passages. A thorough search would require considerable time and good lighting. I made careful notes of all this. Tell me about the days preceding his disappearance. Had Lord Edmund seemed different in any way? Worried, excited, disturbed? Mrs. Holloway's expression grew thoughtful. For perhaps a week before Lady Catherine arrived, Lord Edmund spent almost every hour in the library, barely eating, sleeping only a few hours at night. He seemed driven, sir, as though he'd found something that demanded all his attention. Several times I found him in the morning still dressed in the previous day's clothes, having apparently worked through the night. Did he say anything about what he'd discovered? Nothing specific, but 3 days before he vanished, I brought him tea in the library and found him staring at an old journal with the most peculiar expression. Triumph mixed with horror, if that makes sense. He looked up at me and said, "Mrs. Holloway, it appears my family has been guardian of something extraordinary, something that could rewrite our understanding of history." Then he laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. She paused, her composure wavering slightly. I asked if he was quite well, if perhaps he should rest. He patted my hand, very kind he was, and said he was fine, just overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd learned. He said once he'd verified certain details, he would need to contact various scholars and possibly some government officials. Those were his words. Government officials. This aligned with what Lady Catherine had reported, and added intriguing new dimensions. The night he disappeared, do you know his movements? When he retired, whether he left his rooms? He took dinner alone in his study, not unusual during his period of intense research. Fletcher brought him a tray at 8 o'clock. When Fletcher returned at 10 to collect the dishes, Lord Edmund was still working, surrounded by books and papers. Fletcher asked if he needed anything else, and Lord Edmund said no. He'd be retiring soon. That was the last anyone saw him, and the house was secured for the night. Thomas made his usual rounds at 11 o'clock, checking that all doors and windows were locked. Everything was secure. The night footman, that's young Peter, was on duty through the night, stationed in the hall. He swears no one passed him, no doors opened. I thanked Mrs. Holloway for her detailed information and called in Fletcher next. The valet entered with the dignified bearing of old-school service, his face weathered, but his eyes sharp and observant. "Fletcher, I understand you served Lord Edmund for many years. You must know him better than most." "I've had that honour for 32 years, sir," Fletcher replied, his voice carrying the slight roughness of age. Watched him grow from boy to man, fine gentleman, thoughtful and fair. Had you noticed changes in his behaviour recently? Fletcher's expression grew troubled. Since coming to Greymore, his lordship seemed to find something he'd been missing. Purpose, perhaps. Intellectual engagement. He was happier here than I'd seen him in years. But these last few weeks, something changed. He became obsessed, driven by whatever he'd discovered in his great-uncle's papers. Did he confide in you, share what he'd learned? Not directly, sir, but I could piece together fragments. He'd ask me about family history, about his great-uncle's habits and interests. One evening, he asked if I'd ever noticed anything unusual about the house. Strange sounds, unexplained phenomena. I told him old houses make all manner of noises, but he persisted. He wanted to know if I'd ever heard something like chanting or music from deep within the building. This aligned with Lady Catherine's experience. And had you? Fletcher hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Once or twice, sir, in my first weeks here, I thought I heard something. Late at night, when the house was settling, but I convinced myself it was wind in the chimneys or old pipes expanding and contracting. His lordship seemed disappointed by my answer, as though he'd hoped for confirmation of something specific. The night he disappeared, you were the last to see him. Can you describe his demeanour exactly? Agitated, sir, but also excited. He kept glancing at that old key, the one on his desk, as though it held some crucial answer. He asked me an odd question. He wanted to know if Uncle Nathaniel had ever spent entire nights away from his chambers, perhaps working somewhere else in the house. I said I couldn't speak to that, as I'd never served in this household before his lordship inherited it. He seemed frustrated, said something like, "There must be a space, somewhere in this house, that I haven't found yet." I leaned forward, intensely interested. He was searching for a hidden room? I believe so, sir. He'd been studying architectural plans of the house. I'd seen them spread across his desk. He seemed convinced the plans didn't account for all the space within the walls, that there were missing areas. This was crucial information. Do you know where these architectural plans are now? Still in his study, I imagine, sir. I haven't touched anything in his chambers since he vanished. We spoke for several more minutes, but Fletcher could add little more beyond reinforcing the impression of a man driven by exciting discovery, while simultaneously deeply troubled by its implications. Thomas, the elderly butler, provided mostly confirmation of what I'd already learned. The house had been properly secured. His rounds revealed nothing unusual. He'd heard no disturbances during the night. His testimony was precise and careful, the product of a lifetime in service where attention to detail meant survival. The footman, Peter, when I spoke with him, seemed eager to help but had little to contribute. He'd been stationed in the main hall throughout the night, remaining awake and alert, and swore that no one had passed him, no doors had opened. The one interesting detail he provided was that around 2 a.m, he'd thought he heard something from the direction of the cellars, like stone scraping on stone, he said, but when he investigated, he found nothing amiss. The Wickham sisters, Sarah and Martha, were day staff who departed each evening to their cottage in the village. They'd noticed nothing unusual during their working hours before the disappearance, though Martha shyly mentioned that she'd sometimes felt uncomfortable in certain parts of the house, particularly the corridor leading to the library. "It's silly," I know, she said, blushing, but sometimes it feels like you're being watched in that passage, like the house itself is paying attention to you. Her sister nudged her, embarrassed by this fanciful comment, but I assured them both that all observations mattered, even subjective impressions of atmosphere. By the time I'd finished the interviews, it was approaching noon. Lady Catherine found me in the small sitting room, reviewing my notes. "Any revelations?" she asked, her expression hopeful. "Several interesting threads," I replied, "but nothing conclusive yet. I think our next step should be a thorough exploration of the cellars, particularly the lower levels. Multiple people have mentioned the possibility of hidden spaces, and Edmund himself seemed convinced such spaces existed. Shall we go immediately?" "After lunch, I think, and we'll need good lamps, warm clothing, and perhaps some tools in case we need to move stored items, or investigate walls and floors." We took a light lunch in the morning room, soup and bread, simple but warming. Through the windows, I could see the grounds of Greymore stretching away under their covering of snow. The landscape held a stark beauty, but also an isolation that became oppressive when contemplated too long. Mrs. Holloway had arranged for several oil lamps and candles to be prepared, along with matches and striker. Peter volunteered to accompany us, his local knowledge potentially useful. Thus equipped, we descended through the kitchen area to the cellar stairs. The transition from the inhabited house to these lower regions was immediate and striking. The air grew noticeably colder and carried a different quality. The mineral scent of old stone, a trace of damp, the accumulated smell of centuries. The steps were worn smooth by countless feet, their centers slightly concave from centuries of passage. The uppermost cellar level proved unremarkable. Orderly storage of wines, preserved foods, coal for the house's many fireplaces, and various household supplies. Everything was organized with Mrs. Holloway's characteristic efficiency. A few minutes' examination revealed nothing unusual or suspicious. The stairs continued downward to the older levels, and here the character changed dramatically. The stonework became rougher, clearly medieval in origin. Massive blocks fitted together with remarkable precision, but lacking the refinement of later periods. The ceiling lowered, requiring me to duck my head in places, and the passages branched in multiple directions. Peter led us through this labyrinth with reasonable confidence, pointing out the various storage chambers where Uncle Nathaniel's collections had been placed. We passed through rooms containing crates of documents, shelves bearing artifacts and antiquities, areas draped in dusty canvas where paintings and larger items waited in darkness. "How far does this extend?" I asked, my voice echoing oddly in the confined spaces. "I'm not rightly sure, sir," Peter admitted. "I've been down here only a handful of times, always with specific errands. Mrs. Holloway says there's passages that haven't been opened in decades." We explored systematically, Lady Catherine and I making notes of the layout, trying to develop a mental map of these subterranean spaces. In several locations, I noticed doors or passages that had been sealed with later brickwork, their outlines still visible in the ancient stone. "These blocked passages," I observed to Peter, "do you know where they led?" "Some of them are just alcoves that were closed off, sir, but Mrs. Holloway mentioned that one or two might have been parts of that old tunnel, the escape route from centuries past." We reached an area that seemed to mark the deepest point of the cellars, a large chamber with a vaulted ceiling, its stones blackened by ancient smoke. The room felt different from the others, possessed of a quality I struggled to define. Not quite ominous, but significant, weighted with purpose beyond mere storage. The walls here bore traces of old markings, symbols carved or painted, now barely visible under centuries of grime. I held my lamp close, trying to make them out. They appeared to be crosses of various designs, along with other emblems I couldn't immediately identify. "This chamber has been used for something specific," I murmured, running my fingers over the carved stone. "Something ceremonial, perhaps." Lady Catherine shivered despite her warm clothing. "I don't like this place, Dr. Watson. It feels heavy, like the air itself carries weight." Indeed, the atmosphere did seem oppressive, though whether from psychological expectation or some genuine quality of the space, I couldn't determine. We searched the chamber carefully, examining the walls, floor, and ceiling for any signs of concealed openings or recent disturbance. In one corner, partially hidden behind a pile of old wooden crates, I found something that made my pulse quicken. A section of floor where the dust had been disturbed, showing marks as though the crates had been recently moved and then replaced. "Peter, help me move these," I instructed, and together we shifted the heavy crates aside. Beneath them, the stone floor showed clear evidence of use. Areas wiped relatively clean of dust, and most significantly, what appeared to be the outline of a trapdoor or hatch, though no obvious means of opening it was visible. I knelt, examining the stones carefully. The blocks here fit together with incredible precision, but several showed slight discoloration around their edges, as though they had been moved or disturbed repeatedly. I pressed on various stones, testing for give or movement, and was rewarded when one particular block shifted slightly under pressure. "There's a mechanism," I said excitedly, "concealed in the floor itself. Peter, bring your lamp closer." With the improved light, I could see tiny gaps between certain stones, not the natural settling of ancient construction, but deliberate engineering. I pressed the movable stone more firmly and heard a distinct click, followed by the grinding of stone on stone that Peter had reported hearing in the night. A section of the floor, perhaps 3 feet square, slowly rose on one edge, revealing itself as a masterfully concealed hatch. Cold air rose from the opening, carrying a scent of earth and ancient spaces, long sealed from light and life. I held my lamp over the opening, illuminating stone steps descending into darkness below. Steps that showed recent use, their surfaces cleared of the accumulated dust and debris that would naturally gather over time. "Lord Edmund has been down there," Lady Catherine breathed, her voice a mixture of excitement and dread. "Recently, by the look of it." "Yes," I agreed, and possibly repeatedly. This may be the chamber he mentioned in his notes, the space he was seeking to verify. Peter peered nervously into the opening. Should we go down there, sir?" I considered the question carefully. The sensible answer would be to wait, to bring additional people, to ensure safety and backup. But another night of delay might mean something crucial missed or lost, and the steps themselves called to me with the promise of answers. "We go down," I decided, "but carefully. Peter, you stay here at the opening. If we're not back within 30 minutes, go immediately for help. Don't come after us. Go up and fetch Thomas and others." "Understood." He nodded reluctantly, clearly relieved not to have to descend into that darkness. I let Lady Catherine precede me, reasoning that she should be able to retreat quickly if necessary, with me between her and any potential threat. Our lamps cast dancing shadows on ancient stones as we descended, the steps worn smooth by centuries of feet, but still sound and stable. The passage at the bottom ran perfectly straight, its walls and ceiling carefully constructed of the same massive stones as the cellar above. We were deep beneath the house now, perhaps 20 feet below even the lowest cellar level. The air felt thick and old, as though it had remained undisturbed for generations until recently. The passage extended for perhaps 50 feet before opening into a chamber that took my breath away with its unexpected beauty and strangeness. The space formed a perfect circle, perhaps 25 feet in diameter, its walls lined with niches containing old lamps or braziers. At the chamber's centre stood a circular stone platform, raised slightly above the floor level, its surface carved with an intricate mandala of symbols and designs that seemed to flow and connect in mesmerizing patterns. But what captured our attention immediately were the walls, every inch covered in inscriptions, drawings, diagrams, and what appeared to be centuries of accumulated knowledge recorded in multiple hands and languages. Latin predominated, but I recognized Greek, Hebrew, and other scripts I couldn't immediately identify. "My God," Lady Catherine whispered, her voice small in that circular space. "What is this place?" "A repository," I replied, slowly turning to take it all in. "A hidden library or sanctum where knowledge has been preserved and accumulated over centuries." The sheer volume of information was overwhelming. Dates, names, historical accounts, astronomical charts, alchemical diagrams, religious and mystical symbols, all layered upon each other in a palimpsest of human learning and belief. On the stone platform at the centre lay several objects. The journals Lady Catherine had mentioned Edmund finding in the library above, now open to specific pages, several leather cases containing documents, and most intriguingly, a small wooden chest, ornately carved, standing open to reveal more documents within. I approached carefully, as one might approach a wild animal, not wanting to disturb anything until I understood what I was seeing. The open journal showed an entry dated 1889, recent by the standards of everything else in this chamber, in handwriting that was different from Edmund's, but shared similar characteristics. This would be Uncle Nathaniel's hand, I realized. I read aloud for Lady Catherine's benefit. "After 40 years of research, I believe I have finally understood the truth of Greymoor's founding and purpose. What we call our family estate is, in fact, one of 13 sites established by surviving members of the Knights Templar following their official dissolution. Each site was designated to preserve specific knowledge and artifacts from the Order's holdings, knowledge deemed too dangerous or too sacred to trust to conventional religious or secular authorities. Greymoor specifically holds documentation related to the Order's discoveries in the Holy Land, archaeological findings that challenged orthodox narratives, ancient texts recovered from ruins, evidence of knowledge and practices that predated Christianity by millennia. The chamber beneath the house serves as both archive and ritual space, designed to be opened only by those who inherit not just property, but responsibility, guardianship of truths that must be preserved, but carefully guarded from premature or irresponsible revelation. The entry continued for several more paragraphs, detailing Uncle Nathaniel's research methodology and growing certainty about the chamber's existence and purpose. He had apparently spent decades searching for the means of access, finally discovering references in old family documents to the flaw mechanism we had ourselves just discovered. Another journal, Edmund's own, lay beside his great-uncle's. His entries, dated within the past few weeks, showed his growing excitement and trepidation as he confirmed Uncle Nathaniel's findings and began exploring the chamber himself. One passage in particular struck me with its emotional intensity. What does one do when confronted with knowledge that overturns everything believed certain? The documents here prove incontrovertibly that much of what we call history is either incomplete or deliberately falsified. The Templars preserved evidence of civilizations that flourished and vanished before Egypt, of knowledge systems that integrated what we now separate into science and religion, of human potential barely glimpsed in our current understanding. But they also understood the danger of revealing such knowledge prematurely. They witnessed what happened when the order itself became too visible, too powerful, too threatening to established authorities. They chose survival through concealment, preserving rather than proclaiming, trusting that future generations might find wisdom to use such knowledge constructively. I am now one of 13 inheritors, 13 guardians scattered across Europe, each unknowing of the other's existence, except through coded references in these documents. We maintain separate elements of a vast puzzle, each piece precious but incomplete. Together, the 13 sites hold enough to revolutionize human understanding. Separately, each guards fragments that intrigue but cannot quite reveal the whole. The responsibility weighs more heavily than I can easily bear. Part of me wants to shout these discoveries from rooftops, to force confrontation with comfortable certainties. But I understand now why Uncle Nathaniel spent decades in silence. Some truths require preparation to receive them properly. I looked up from the journal to find Lady Catherine staring at the wall inscriptions, tears streaming down her face. "He was trying to carry all this alone," she said softly. "No wonder he seemed overwhelmed. How does one person bear such knowledge and responsibility?" I had no ready answer. Instead, I continued examining the chamber, looking for any indication of where Edmund might have gone, or what might have happened to him. The chamber itself showed no signs of struggle or disturbance beyond Edmund's recent use. On the stone platform, I noticed something I'd initially missed. A piece of paper, apparently modern, showing a sketch of symbols, and beneath them, directions written in Edmund's hand. Verification required in person. The document describes a marker stone 1 mile north-northeast from the house, bearing specific symbols. If stone exists as described, then documentation is genuine, not elaborate fabrication. Must confirm before proceeding. "He went out to search for this marker," I said, understanding suddenly becoming clear. That's why he left the house. He needed physical confirmation of what the documents claimed. "But the snow," Lady Catherine protested. "There were no footprints in the snow around the house. How could he have left without leaving traces?" I looked again at the passage we'd entered through, then carefully examined the walls of the circular chamber. On one side, partially concealed behind a section that appeared solid, I found what I had suspected. Another passage. This one leading not back toward the house, but away, angling upward gradually. "The escape tunnel," I said quietly. "It does exist, and it's still passable. Edmund used it to leave the house without being seen. The tunnel likely emerges somewhere beyond the immediate grounds, in the woods perhaps, where snow wouldn't reveal his route as clearly." Lady Catherine's expression shifted from confusion to horror. If he went out in the night during the storm, wearing insufficient clothing, searching for some stone marker. She didn't need to complete the thought. The implications were clear and grim. Someone caught in a snowstorm, inadequately dressed, potentially disoriented, could easily succumb to exposure within hours. "We need to organize a proper search party," I said firmly. "Now that we know where to focus, north-northeast from here, within perhaps a mile or two, we have a realistic chance of finding him." We retraced our path quickly, emerging from the concealed hatch to find Peter still faithfully maintaining his watch. His relief at our return was palpable. "Did you find anything, sir?" he asked eagerly. "We found where Lord Edmund went, and likely why," I replied. "Now we need to find Lord Edmund himself. Peter, go quickly and tell Mrs. Holloway to assemble every able-bodied person she can find. We're organizing a search party. We'll need ropes, blankets, any materials for improvised stretchers, and everyone should dress warmly. Tell them we search north-northeast of the house, looking for a marker stone and any signs of recent passage." Peter disappeared rapidly up the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the ancient spaces. Lady Catherine and I followed more slowly, both of us processing what we'd discovered in that remarkable hidden chamber. "Even if we find Edmund," she said quietly as we climbed, "how do we proceed from there? The knowledge in that chamber, the responsibility he wrote about, it doesn't simply vanish because we've discovered it. Someone must still serve as guardian. One crisis at a time," I counseled gently. "First, we find your brother. Then, we address the broader implications of what he's discovered." We emerged from the cellars into the bright, cold clarity of midday. Through windows, I could see that the weather had improved dramatically. The snow had stopped, clouds were breaking, and pale sunlight was attempting to reassert itself. The timing felt providential, as though nature itself had decided to assist our search. Within 30 minutes, Mrs. Holloway had assembled a party of 12. Every household member, plus several men from the estate's ground staff. I explained the direction and general parameters of our search, without revealing the full story of the hidden chamber and Edmund's midnight quest. We set out in a line, spaced widely enough to cover ground effectively, but close enough to remain in visual contact. The snow was deep, in places over 2 feet, making progress slow and exhausting. But the clear weather allowed good visibility, and the low sun created strong shadows that would make any irregularities in the landscape stand out clearly. For nearly an hour, we searched methodically, sweeping across the area north-northeast of the house. The landscape here consisted of rolling fields, interrupted by occasional hedgerows and small copses of trees. The snow lay mostly undisturbed, showing only the tracks of wildlife, rabbits, foxes, the delicate prints of birds. Then Sarah, one of the Wickham sisters, called out sharply, her voice carrying across the snow. We converged on her position to find what she'd spotted, a line of depressions in the snow, partially filled by later snowfall, but still visible, showing where someone had walked, fallen, risen, walked again. The trail led toward a small stand of ancient oaks, their massive trunks dark against the white landscape. We followed the disturbed snow, hope and dread warring in my chest, knowing we might be following a trail to tragedy. In the centre of the oak grove, we found him. Lord Edmund Pemberton lay curled at the base of the largest tree, his body partially covered by snow, completely still. Lady Catherine cried out and ran forward, but I caught her arm gently. "Let me check first," I said quietly, then moved forward myself, my medical training asserting itself, despite the emotional weight of the moment. I knelt beside Edmund's still form, quickly checking for signs of life. His skin was cold, his clothing soaked through, and for a terrible moment, I thought we'd arrived too late. Then I detected it. A pulse, faint and irregular, but present. He lived, though barely. "He's alive," I called to the search party, "but in critical condition. We need to get him back to the house immediately and warm him very gradually. Bring the blankets. We'll wrap him carefully and carry him on the improvised stretcher." The next 30 minutes passed in focused activity. We wrapped Edmund in every blanket we'd brought, then lifted him carefully onto the stretcher made of poles and canvas. 4 men took the corners, and we began the slow, careful journey back to Greymore House. Lady Catherine walked beside the stretcher, her hand on her brother's shoulder, speaking quietly to him, though he showed no sign of awareness. Tears froze on her cheeks, but her expression showed determination rather than despair. As we walked, I caught sight of something that must have been Edmund's goal, a standing stone, perhaps 5 feet tall and 2 feet wide, mostly buried in snow, but visible in profile against the landscape. Even at a distance, I could see symbols carved into its weathered surface, exactly as the documents in the hidden chamber had described. He'd found his verification, confirmed that the ancient records spoke truth, but the cost of that confirmation had nearly been his life. Back at the house, we carried Edmund directly to his chambers, where Mrs. Holloway had already prepared everything with her characteristic efficiency. A fire blazing in the hearth, hot water bottles wrapped in towels, warm bricks heating on the hearth to place near his body, and every blanket in the house assembled and ready. My medical training directed the household in the careful process of treating severe exposure. The greatest danger was warming him too quickly, which could send his body into shock. We removed his wet clothing, dried his skin carefully, then wrapped him in warmed blankets. The hot water bottles and heated bricks we placed near, but not directly against, his body, creating gradual warmth. His pulse remained weak, but showed no further deterioration. His breathing, though shallow, maintained a relatively steady rhythm. His extremities showed some frostbite. Fingers and toes would require particular attention once his core temperature stabilized, but nothing appeared severe enough to threaten permanent damage if treated properly. For hours, I maintained vigil, monitoring his condition, adjusting the warming measures, watching for any signs of improvement or crisis. Lady Catherine remained at his bedside, her presence itself a kind of medicine, her voice a constant whisper of encouragement and love. As evening approached, Edmund's colour began to improve, his pulse strengthened, and his breathing deepened. He remained unconscious, but these signs suggested his body was successfully fighting back from the edge of death. At some point, Mrs. Holloway appeared with tea and sandwiches, insisting that Lady Catherine and I must maintain our own strength. We ate mechanically, neither wanting to leave Edmund's bedside, but recognizing the wisdom of her insistence. "Will he recover fully?" Lady Catherine asked me quietly. "I believe so," I replied honestly. "He's past the most critical danger. The next concern is pneumonia, possible when someone has been exposed to such extreme cold and wet. We'll need to watch carefully for fever or respiratory symptoms over the next few days, but his youth and previous good health work in his favour. She nodded, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. He was always healthy, hardly ever ill as a child. I used to joke that he was too curious to stay sick, too busy wondering about the world to waste time in bed. No, she agreed. They're the actions of a man possessed by discovery, driven by knowledge that seemed to demand immediate confirmation. That chamber we found, the hidden sanctum, it would consume anyone's reason, at least temporarily. We sat in silence for a time, listening to the fire crackle, to Edmund's quiet breathing, to the house settling around us in the gathering darkness. Someone, Mrs. Holloway probably, had lit lamps throughout the house, creating islands of warm light against the winter night. Around 8 o'clock, Edmund stirred for the first time, a slight movement of his head, a flutter of his eyelids. Lady Catherine leaned forward immediately, taking his hand in both of hers. "Edmund, can you hear me? You're safe. You're home." His eyes opened slightly, unfocused at first, then gradually clearing. He looked at her, recognition slowly dawning, then turned his head to see me sitting nearby. "Catherine." His voice was barely a whisper, rough from cold and exposure. "What? How?" "Hush," she soothed. "Don't try to talk yet. You've been very ill. Dr. Watson found you. Found us, actually. Everything will be explained, but for now, you need to rest and recover." "The stone," he whispered urgently, trying to rise. "Did you see it? The stone with the symbols? I found it, exactly where the document said. It's all real, Catherine, all of it." "I know," she assured him, gently pressing him back down. "We found the chamber, Edmund. We know what you discovered. But you mustn't distress yourself now. Your health is what matters. The chamber and its secrets have waited centuries. They can wait a few more days." He subsided, exhaustion and weakness overcoming his urgency. But before his eyes closed again, he looked at me with an expression of profound relief. "Thank you," he breathed. "Thank you for finding me. I thought I was so cold, so tired. I thought I would die there, with no one ever knowing what I'd found, what it meant. Rest now," I told him firmly. "We'll talk when you're stronger. But yes, we understand the significance of your discovery. You're not alone with this knowledge anymore." He smiled faintly, then sleep claimed him again. But this was natural sleep, restorative rather than the unconsciousness of exposure. His breathing deepened, his colour continued to improve, and the tension that had held his body rigid began to ease. Lady Catherine finally allowed herself to weep, not tears of grief, but of relief, releasing the fear and tension that had sustained her through the past days. I quietly withdrew to give her privacy, stepping into the corridor where Fletcher stood, waiting anxiously. "He'll recover," I told the elderly valet, seeing the question in his eyes. "It will take time, but Lord Edmund will be well again." The relief that washed over Fletcher's face reminded me how deeply servants can care for those they serve. Their loyalty, a form of love that society rarely acknowledges properly. "Thank God," Fletcher said quietly. "Thank God you came, Dr. Watson. Without you, I don't think we'd have found him in time." I accepted his gratitude with a simple nod, then made my way downstairs to send a telegram to Holmes, updating him on the situation and the remarkable discoveries. The local telegraph office would be closed for the night, but I could write the message now and have it sent first thing in the morning. In the library, that room where Edmund had spent so many hours pursuing his uncle's research, I found paper and pen and composed a detailed account. Holmes. Mystery solved. Subject found alive but seriously ill from exposure. Remarkable discovery beneath house. Hidden sanctum containing historical documents and artifacts of extraordinary significance. Claims regarding Templar preservation of controversial knowledge appear substantiated. Subject's obsession understandable, given magnitude of discovery. Recommend your consultation when subject sufficiently recovered. Medical prognosis favourable. Will remain on site several more days. Watson. But those were questions for another day. Tonight, the important thing was that a life had been saved, a family reunited, and mysteries that might have remained forever hidden had been brought into light. However carefully, that light might need to be controlled. I returned to Edmund's chambers to find him sleeping peacefully, and Lady Catherine dozing in her chair beside his bed, exhausted by days of fear and tension finally released. I added another log to the fire, checked his vital signs one more time, pulse stronger, breathing steady, colour good, then quietly withdrew to my own room. The green room welcomed me with its warmth and comfort. I prepared for bed mechanically, my mind reviewing the day's remarkable events. As I settled into the armchair for a few moments before sleep, I found myself contemplating the responsibilities that knowledge brings. Edmund had written of being unable to bear the weight alone, of understanding why his great-uncle had spent decades in silence. The documents in that hidden chamber presumably contained information that could indeed overturn accepted histories, challenge comfortable certainties, force humanity to reconsider fundamental assumptions about its past and, by extension, its present and future. But truth, I reflected, carries its own imperatives. Once discovered, it demands acknowledgement, however uncomfortable that acknowledgement might be. The question wasn't whether such knowledge should be preserved or destroyed, but rather how it should be revealed, what context should surround it, what preparation might make its reception most constructive. These were philosophical questions beyond my capacity to fully answer. They would require Holmes's remarkable intellect, certainly, but also scholars, historians, perhaps theologians and philosophers. The process Edmund described, 13 guardians maintaining separate fragments, suggested a deliberate system for preserving knowledge while controlling its release. Perhaps that system had wisdom worth respecting. The wind had risen again, sighing around the house's corners with the voice of winter, asserting its continued dominance despite our small human triumphs. But inside, all was warmth and safety, crisis resolved, family preserved. I finally surrendered to sleep, my last conscious thought a kind of gratitude for the human capacity for curiosity, even when dangerous, for the bonds of loyalty and love that motivate us to persist against odds, for the simple fact that against the vast indifference of winter and night, we can create small sanctuaries of warmth and light where life and hope endure. The following days established a comfortable rhythm focused on Edmund's recovery. His constitution proved as strong as his sister had predicted. The fever we'd feared never materialized, and his strength returned steadily. By the third day after his rescue, he was sitting up in bed, taking solid food, and showing signs of the intellectual energy that had driven him to such dangerous extremes. I spent considerable time with him, conducting thorough medical examinations, but also allowing him to speak about what he'd discovered and how he'd come to make such a nearly fatal decision. The story emerged gradually, told in fragments as his strength allowed. I became obsessed, he admitted ruefully, his fingers absently rubbing the frostbitten tips that were healing well but remained sensitive. Uncle Nathaniel's journals opened a door in my mind, and I couldn't rest until I'd walked through it completely. Every document I read in that chamber raised 10 new questions, suggested 10 new connections. I lost all sense of proportion. "The night you disappeared," I prompted gently, "what drove you to go out in such conditions?" He looked toward the window, where pale sunlight streamed through, creating bars of light and shadow across his bed. I'd found the description of the marker stone, a standing stone 1 mile northeast of the house, bearing specific symbols that were described in extraordinary detail. If that stone existed exactly as described, it would prove that the documents I'd been reading were genuine historical accounts, rather than elaborate period fabrications. And you couldn't wait for morning, for better weather, for proper preparation. He smiled wryly. Rationality wasn't my strong suit in that moment. I knew the tunnel existed. I'd found instructions for accessing it in Uncle Nathaniel's notes. I reasoned that I could slip out through the tunnel, walk a mile, verify the stone's existence, and return before anyone knew I'd been gone. Simple, quick, definitive. But the storm, Lady Catherine interjected from her chair near the fire. Surely you knew how dangerous the weather was. I thought I knew the direction precisely. 1 mile, 30 minutes walk, even in snow. I brought a compass, a dark lantern to shield the light, warm clothing. I thought I'd prepared adequately. He paused, pain crossing his face as memory returned. What I failed to account for was how disorienting a snowstorm becomes, how it obliterates landmarks, how cold saps your judgment and your will. His voice dropped lower. I found the stone. That much I achieved. It stood exactly where the documents indicated, bearing the symbols precisely as described. I felt such triumph in that moment, such vindication. But by then, the storm had intensified. I tried to retrace my path, but I'd lost the direction. The wind kept turning me around, and the snow fell so heavily I couldn't see more than a few feet. "You should have stayed at the stone," I observed, "sheltered there and waited for daylight." Lady Catherine's eyes glistened with tears, but she remained silent, letting her brother complete his account. I remember darkness, then fragments of consciousness, voices, warmth, pain returning to my extremities. I thought I'd died and was experiencing something beyond death, finding myself alive, here, with you both. It felt like resurrection. We sat quietly for a time, each contemplating how close we'd come to a different outcome, how narrow the margin between recovery and tragedy. "What do we do now?" Edmund finally asked, looking between his sister and me. "The chamber exists, the documents exist, the knowledge exists. It won't conveniently disappear because I nearly died preserving its secrecy. Holmes will have thoughts on this," I said. "I've sent him a detailed account, and I expect he'll come to Greymore as soon as his schedule permits. He has connections with government officials and scholarly institutions. Between us, we should be able to develop a sensible approach to the material you've discovered." "The documents describe 12 other sites," Edmund said quietly. 12 other guardians, presumably still unknown to each other. Part of me wants to seek them out, to bring together the fragments they preserve. but the very structure of the system suggests that complete assembly might be dangerous, that the knowledge was deliberately fragmented to prevent hasty or destructive use. Questions of wisdom, not just questions of fact, I observed. That makes them infinitely more complex. Lady Catherine stood and moved to her brother's bedside, taking his hand gently. "Edmund, you've carried this alone long enough. Let others share the weight. You nearly died trying to bear it single-handedly. Promise me you'll let Dr. Watson and Mr. Holmes help, that you'll trust in collaboration rather than solitary burden." "I promise," he said softly, squeezing her hand. "I've learned, painfully, that some discoveries require community rather than individual heroism." The door opened to admit Mrs. Holloway, carrying a tea tray, her face showing the relief of a household that had recovered its equilibrium. "Tea, my lord, my lady, doctor, and Mrs. Wickham sent up some of her famous ginger biscuits. She said Lord Edmund always liked them as a boy." "She remembers correctly," Edmund said, with genuine warmth. "Please convey my thanks, and my thanks to everyone who searched for me. I'm very aware that I owe my life to this household's loyalty and Dr. Watson's detective skills." "We're just grateful you're recovering, my lord," Mrs. Holloway replied, her voice thick with emotion. "This house hasn't been the same without you at its heart." After she departed, we shared tea and the ginger biscuits, simple pleasures made profound by recent events. The winter sunlight streaming through the windows suggested that despite the season's hardness, life and warmth persisted, endured, renewed themselves. Over the following days, I continued to monitor Edmund's physical recovery, while also beginning the delicate work of documenting what he'd discovered. With his permission, I spent several hours in the hidden chamber, making sketches of the most significant inscriptions, copying passages from documents, trying to develop a catalogue of what the sanctum contained. The sheer volume was overwhelming. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, observation, speculation, and documentation. The walls themselves formed a kind of encyclopedia, with later editions referencing and building upon earlier entries. I recognized the hands of multiple contributors, suggesting that Uncle Nathaniel had not been alone in his guardianship, but had perhaps corresponded with others who contributed material to the collection. The subjects covered ranged from the genuinely historical, detailed accounts of Templar activities, suppressed religious controversies, archaeological discoveries never officially reported, to the more speculative, alchemical theories, mystical practices, astronomical observations, suggesting advanced ancient knowledge. What struck me most was the careful, methodical quality of the documentation. This wasn't wild speculation or fantasy, but patient, rigorous scholarship, attempting to preserve and make sense of information that mainstream authorities had rejected or suppressed. One evening, as I sat in the library reviewing my notes, Lady Catherine joined me, settling into the chair opposite with her own teacup. "It's remarkable, isn't it?" she observed. "How much can be hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life? This house appeared to be simply an old country estate. Instead, it's a treasury of controversial knowledge, maintained by a secret network of guardians for centuries." "It raises questions about what else might be hidden," I agreed. "How much of what we call history is actually curated memory, edited and sanitized to support particular narratives and power structures? The thought is both exciting and disturbing." Edmund says the Templars preserved this knowledge because they understood that truth has its own power, independent of whether institutions acknowledge it. They believed that as long as accurate records existed, even if hidden, the possibility remained for future generations to reclaim that knowledge when the time was right. And is the time right now? I asked. Is our present age prepared to receive this material constructively? She smiled. A question philosophers could debate for decades. But Edmund believes, and I'm inclined to agree, that knowledge hidden forever becomes effectively the same as knowledge destroyed. At some point, revelation becomes necessary, even if it disrupts comfortable certainties. The clock on the mantel chimed the hour, its sound peaceful and measured, marking time's passage with neither judgment nor urgency. Outside, I could hear the wind in the trees, a gentler sound now than during the storm that had nearly killed Edmund. "Have you thought about what happens after you leave here?" Lady Catherine asked. "Will you write about this? Include it in your chronicles of Mr. Holmes's investigations?" "I'm not certain," I admitted. The case itself, Edmund's disappearance and recovery, presents no difficulties, but the nature of what he discovered, the implications of the hidden chamber, that requires more careful consideration. Holmes will have opinions, certainly, and presumably Edmund himself should have significant input into whether and how his discoveries become public knowledge. "He's already indicated he wants the material shared with appropriate scholars," she said, "under controlled conditions, with proper context and interpretation. He envisions a multi-year project, carefully managed, with publications gradually revealing different aspects of the collection." "That seems sensible," I agreed. "Gradual revelation allows time for absorption, for scholarly response, for public adjustment to new information. The alternative, dumping everything at once, might create more confusion than enlightenment." We sat companionably for a while longer, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals, comfortable with silence and the simple pleasure of safety and warmth after crisis survived. Holmes arrived 3 days later, his tall form emerging from a carriage with characteristic energy despite the long journey from London. His keen eyes took in Greymoor's exterior in a single sweeping glance, and I knew he was cataloguing architectural details, assessing grounds layout, and forming preliminary deductions before we'd even exchanged greetings. "Watson," he called, striding toward where I stood at the entrance. "Your telegrams suggested a case of considerable interest. I've been able to think of little else since receiving them." "It's certainly remarkable," I agreed, shaking his hand warmly. "I'm eager to hear your thoughts on various aspects of the situation." I'd arranged with Lady Catherine for Holmes to have one of the guest rooms, and after he'd settled in and taken some refreshment, I provided him with a detailed verbal account of everything that had transpired. He listened with intense focus, occasionally interrupting with sharp questions that inevitably identified gaps or ambiguities in my narrative. When I finished, he sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers in his characteristic gesture of deep thought. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "The detective problem itself is interesting. The seemingly impossible disappearance, the locked house, the snow without footprints, but the underlying situation, the hidden chamber, the preserved knowledge, the network of guardians, that transcends ordinary investigation." "Will you examine the chamber?" I asked. "I've made what documentation I could, but your observational skills will certainly notice details I've missed." "Naturally," he agreed. But first, I should meet our recovered subject and form my own assessment of his character and motivations. Cases involving potentially valuable discoveries always raise questions of whether the discoveries are genuine or whether they serve some hidden agenda. I arranged the introduction for that afternoon. Edmund had now progressed to dressing in normal clothes and moving about his rooms, though he still tired easily, and we'd advised against attempting stairs. Holmes entered the sick room with his usual purposeful energy, but I noted how his expression softened slightly when he observed Edmund's still evident frailty. "Lord Pemberton," Holmes said, extending his hand, "I'm glad to find you recovering. Watson's account suggested you came quite close to permanent absence from these proceedings." "Too close," Edmund agreed, his grip weak, but his voice gaining strength daily. "I'm very grateful to Dr. Watson for his detective work. Without his deductions and organization of the search, I would have died in that oak grove." "Watson has his moments of genuine insight," Holmes said, with a slight smile that took the edge off what might otherwise have seemed dismissive. "Now, I understand you've made a discovery of considerable historical significance. Would you be willing to describe it from your own perspective? Sometimes the discoverer's account reveals nuances that second-hand reports miss." For the next hour, Edmund spoke with growing passion about his great-uncle's research, his own discoveries in the hidden chamber, and the implications of what the sanctum contained. Holmes listened intently, occasionally interjecting questions that demonstrated his remarkable breadth of knowledge. He was clearly familiar with Templar history, medieval religious controversies, and various suppressed or alternative historical narratives. "The question," Holmes said when Edmund had finished, "is verification. History is littered with forged documents, elaborately constructed hoaxes, and well-meaning but mistaken interpretations. Before we proceed with any assumptions about the material's significance, we need rigorous authentication." "Agreed entirely," Edmund said. "That's precisely why I went out to confirm the marker stone's existence. I needed to verify that the document's descriptions corresponded to physical reality rather than elaborate fantasy. And you succeeded in that verification, nearly at the cost of your life," Holmes observed. "But one confirmed detail doesn't authenticate an entire collection. What we need is systematic examination by multiple experts, cross-referencing with other known sources, material analysis of documents to verify their claimed ages." "I'm prepared to facilitate that," Edmund assured him. "In fact, I welcome it. The last thing I want is to build grand theories on faulty foundations. If the documents prove to be fabrications, I'd rather know that now than after committing years to their study." Holmes nodded approvingly. A properly scientific attitude. "I know several scholars at the British Museum and the Royal Historical Society who could be consulted discreetly. We might also involve some academic historians specializing in medieval period. The key is maintaining confidentiality until we have solid verification. Premature revelation of unverified materials serves no one." They continued discussing practical approaches to authentication and eventual revelation, and I found myself impressed by how well their minds worked together, despite their different backgrounds. Edmund brought passionate scholarship and intimate knowledge of the materials. Holmes contributed methodological rigor and connections to institutional resources. As they spoke, I observed something else, a visible lightening of the burden Edmund had been carrying. Sharing responsibility with capable collaborators clearly relieved the isolation that had driven him to such extremes. This was the wisdom Lady Catherine had tried to convey to her brother. Some discoveries require communities rather than lone heroes. After our conversation with Edmund, I guided Holmes down to the hidden chamber. We made the journey with good lighting and took our time examining every detail of the underground passage and the circular sanctum. Holmes spent nearly 2 hours in that remarkable space, examining inscriptions with his magnifying glass, photographing selected sections with the portable camera he'd brought, carefully handling documents while making notes in his precise handwriting. He paid particular attention to the stone platform at the chamber's centre, examining the carved symbols with intense focus. "These carvings show genuine age," he murmured. "The patina of centuries, wear patterns consistent with very old stonework, and the symbols themselves. I recognize some from genuine Templar sources, others from even older traditions. This isn't recent fabrication attempting to look old. This chamber has served its purpose for a very long time." "So, you believe the materials are authentic?" I asked. "I believe the chamber itself is certainly genuine. Medieval construction, certainly pre-Reformation. As for the documents and inscriptions, that requires more detailed analysis, but my preliminary assessment is favourable. The handwriting shows evolution over centuries. Different hands, different periods, different materials. That kind of consistency is nearly impossible to fabricate convincingly." He moved to examine the wall inscriptions more closely. "Look here, Watson. You can see layers of information added over time. Earlier inscriptions in Latin, later additions in English, cross-references and annotations, showing how knowledge accumulated and was organized. This is authentic scholarship, not theatrical set dressing." "Then Edmund's discoveries are genuine," I pressed. "The historical claims, the preserved knowledge, all of it." Holmes turned to face me, his expression thoughtful. "The physical evidence suggests genuine historical preservation, yes. But whether the interpretations and claims are accurate, that's a different question. One can authentically preserve inaccurate information, faithfully transmit mistaken beliefs. We'll need to evaluate not just the document's age, but their content's validity." "A project requiring years," I observed. "Decades, more likely," he agreed. "But fascinating work for those with the patience and expertise to pursue it properly." We emerged from the chamber as afternoon was declining toward evening. I showed Holmes the external opening of the escape tunnel, which we discovered in the woods about a quarter-mile from the house, carefully concealed but still passable for someone who knew where to look. "This explains the absence of footprints from the house itself," Holmes observed. "Edmund departed through the tunnel, emerged here beyond the immediate grounds, then walked toward his marker stone. The snow that fell during and after his departure concealed his exit point and his initial route. A solution that seems obvious in retrospect, I admitted, but which took us considerable effort to discover. Most solutions seem obvious once revealed, Holmes said with a slight smile. The art lies in finding them before the answer becomes clear. That evening, all of us gathered in the library. Holmes, Lady Catherine, Edmund, carefully brought downstairs with assistants, Mrs. Holloway, included at Edmund's insistence, and myself. We sat around the fire with tea and glasses of excellent port, discussing how to proceed with the remarkable discoveries beneath Greymore House. Holmes outlined his proposal. I suggest a 3-phase approach. First, quiet authentication by trusted experts, under agreements of confidentiality. This verifies the material's genuineness and establishes their scholarly value. Second, careful cataloguing and documentation, creating a complete inventory of what the chamber contains. Third, gradual scholarly publication, beginning with less controversial materials and slowly revealing the more challenging content. This process could take 20 years, Edmund observed. Possibly longer, Holmes agreed. But consider the alternative. Immediate, uncontrolled revelation would create sensation, controversy, and quite possibly destructive backlash. The materials might be dismissed as hoaxes, or seized by authorities concerned about religious or political implications. Patient, methodical revelation through established scholarly channels gives the information its best chance of eventual acceptance. There's also the matter of the other 12 sites, Lady Catherine interjected. Edmund's documents mention them, but provide no specific locations or contact information for other guardians. Should we attempt to locate them? Holmes considered this carefully. Perhaps eventually, but not immediately. Lord Pemberton's near-fatal experience demonstrates the dangers of obsessive pursuit. Better to focus on properly managing what we already know exists, establishing good precedents and processes. If other guardians exist and operate as the system apparently intends, they'll maintain their own materials independently. If opportunities for contact arise naturally, we can explore them then. Mrs. Holloway spoke up tentatively. If I may say so, sir, the house itself has always felt like it was waiting for something. Uncle Nathaniel used to say the Stones had patience, that they'd waited centuries and could wait centuries more if necessary. Perhaps this is simply the time for patient revelation to begin. Wise words, Holmes acknowledged. And they suggest another consideration. This household has served as guardian for generations. That service should be honoured and preserved. Whatever scholarly examination occurs, it should happen here at Greymore as much as possible, respecting the site's historical role. Edmund's expression showed deep relief. I'd hoped you'd say that. I have no desire to see everything carted off to London or distributed among various institutions. This house has been the sanctum's guardian. It should remain so. We talked late into the evening, working out practical details, discussing potential scholars who might be trusted with early authentication work, considering how to fund the lengthy project Edmund's discovery required. The conversation had a quality of beginning something significant, of commitments being made that would extend far beyond the immediate crisis that had brought us together. Eventually, Edmund's fatigue became apparent, and we helped him back to his rooms. Holmes and I remained in the library, sitting in comfortable silence and watching the fire burn lower. It's a remarkable case, Holmes finally said. Not a crime, precisely, unless you count the crime of historical suppression, but significant nonetheless. Will you write it up for publication? I asked. He smiled slightly. I think this one belongs to you, Watson. You did the detective work, found the hidden chamber, organised the search party, saved Lord Pemberton's life. I merely arrived after the essential mystery was solved. Your chronicle should reflect that you're quite capable of independent investigation when circumstances require it. I appreciate the confidence, I said, though I'll want to discuss with you how much to reveal and what might need to remain confidential. Naturally, but the basic narrative, a scholar disappearing from a locked house during a snowstorm, the discovery of a hidden sanctum, the rescue of the missing man, That story has enough intrigue without requiring extensive revelation of the historical materials. You can describe the chamber's existence and general purpose without cataloguing its specific contents. A story of mystery and rescue, then, rather than historical revelation. Exactly. Leave the historical implications for future scholars to explore and publish through academic channels. Your readers want detection and adventure, not theological controversies. We sat quietly for a while longer, then retired to our respective rooms. Mine had become familiar over the past week. The green room with its William Morris wallpaper, its comfortable bed, its fireplace that had burned through so many evenings of thought and rest. That trust in future generations felt both humbling and inspiring. We were recipients of their patience and faith, beneficiaries of their long guardianship. And now we bore the responsibility to manage their legacy wisely, neither suppressing it further, nor revealing it irresponsibly. The weight of that responsibility I understood better now, having seen how it had affected Edmund, driven him to extremes, nearly cost him his life, but shared among multiple capable people. Holmes, Lady Catherine, trusted scholars. The weight became bearable, even energizing rather than crushing. I slept deeply that night, free from the strange sounds that had disturbed earlier rest, perhaps because the house itself sensed that its long-held secrets had found appropriate guardians for the next phase of their existence. The following days brought a comfortable rhythm of recovery, consolidation, and planning. Holmes remained at Greymore for nearly a week, conducting thorough examinations of the chamber and beginning the authentication process with several discreet experts brought from London. Edmund's strength returned steadily. By the end of that week, he was moving about the house normally, though still avoiding undue exertion. The frostbite damage to his fingers and toes healed remarkably well. He would keep all his digits and regain full function, which had been my primary medical concern. Lady Catherine proved invaluable in organising the practical aspects of the scholarly project taking shape. She established correspondence with potential funding sources, began creating the systematic catalogue Holmes had proposed, and generally served as the administrative backbone the entire enterprise required. Mrs. Holloway and the household staff adapted quickly to the new reality of Greymoor's purpose becoming more openly acknowledged. The house that had always been a quiet scholar's retreat would now gradually become a research centre, hosting visiting academics and serving as headquarters for long-term historical investigation. On my final evening before returning to London, I took a solitary walk around the grounds, wanting to fix the place in memory. The snow had mostly melted in the past week's warmer weather, revealing the landscape's bones. Rolling fields, ancient trees, stone walls marking boundaries established centuries ago. I walked to the oak grove where we'd found Edmund, standing for a moment where he'd lain near death. The trees seemed benevolent now, rather than threatening, their massive trunks speaking of endurance through centuries of seasons. How many human dramas had played out beneath their branches? How many lives had they witnessed from beginning to end? I continued to the standing stone that had been Edmund's goal that nearly fatal night. It rose from the earth like an ancient finger pointing skyward, its surface marked with symbols I now recognized from the chamber's inscriptions. Someone, possibly Templars, possibly earlier inhabitants of this land, had erected this marker to encode knowledge in stone more permanent than any manuscript. The symbols seem to ask questions rather than provide answers. What do you preserve? What do you transmit? What legacy will you leave for those who come after? Questions humanity had grappled with since consciousness first allowed us to contemplate our own mortality and wonder what might persist beyond our individual endings. As evening approached and the sun declined toward the horizon, I returned to the house, where warm light glowed in windows like promises of comfort and community. Inside, I found the others gathered in the drawing room: Edmund, Lady Catherine, Holmes, Mrs. Holloway, sharing conversation and tea in that easy companionship that develops among people who have weathered crisis together. "Ah, Watson," Holmes said as I entered. "We were just discussing whether you'd gotten lost contemplating the landscape. Lady Catherine suggested you might be composing poetic descriptions for your narrative." "Guilty as charged," I admitted with a smile, accepting the cup of tea Lady Catherine poured for me. "Some places demand contemplation. This is certainly one of them." "Will you write about this?" Edmund asked. "I mean beyond the detective story elements. Will you capture the feeling of the place? The weight of what we've discovered?" "I'll try," I said honestly, though words always seem inadequate to experiences that touch us deeply. I can describe what happened, report what we found, but conveying the significance, the sense of connection to long chains of human effort and hope, that's more challenging. "Do your best," Lady Catherine encouraged. "Even imperfect testimony to extraordinary events serves a purpose, and your readers have come to trust your narrative voice, your eye for detail, combined with emotional honesty." We sat together as darkness fell fully, the room lit by lamps and firelight. The winter night held at bay beyond windows that reflected our gathering like a painting of domestic tranquility. Yet beneath that surface, tranquility ran deeper currents. Knowledge of what lay hidden beneath the house. Awareness of questions that would occupy scholars for generations. Recognition that we'd become part of something larger than ourselves. Holmes departed the following morning, returning to London and the various cases awaiting his attention. We stood together in the courtyard as his carriage was prepared, the air cold but clear, the sky that particular shade of winter blue that seems almost artificial in its intensity. "You've done well, Watson," he said quietly. "Independent investigation, sound medical treatment, and careful handling of a situation requiring both discretion and scholarly integrity. I'm not sure I would have managed it better myself." Coming from Holmes, this represented extraordinary praise. "I had good training," I replied simply. "We train each other," he said, then smiled. "Though I suppose I should receive primary credit for your development as a detective. Your modesty sometimes oversteps proper attribution." I laughed. The familiar pattern of his self-assurance combined with genuine friendship, a comfort in itself. "I'll be sure to note your foundational role in any chronicle I produce." "See that you do," he said with mock severity, then extended his hand for a firm shake. "Return to London when you're satisfied. Everything here is properly arranged. The criminal classes have been insufficiently attentive in your absence. I may require your assistance with several accumulated cases." After his departure, I spent one more day at Greymore, conducting final checks on Edmund's medical condition and helping establish some initial organizational structures for the scholarly work beginning to take shape. By the end of that day, I felt comfortable that the household had transitioned successfully from crisis to purposeful activity. I departed on a grey afternoon, the carriage carrying me away from Greymore through countryside, still marked by winter, but beginning to show the first subtle signs of approaching spring. Swelling buds on trees, the particular quality of light that speaks of lengthening days, birds returning from wherever they'd sheltered through the hardest cold. As we travelled, I reviewed in my mind everything that had occurred, beginning to shape it into narrative form. The mystery of the disappearance, the investigation and discovery of the hidden chamber, the desperate search and rescue, and finally, the revelation of the chamber's extraordinary contents. Each element had its place in a story that I knew would interest my readers, while also raising profound questions about history, knowledge, and the responsibilities discovery brings. The train journey from Ashford Bridge to London provided time for reflection and note-taking. I wrote steadily as familiar landscapes passed beyond the window, capturing details while they remained fresh, organizing events into coherent sequence, trying to convey both the detective puzzle and the deeper significance beneath. London welcomed me with its usual combination of vitality and grime, so different from Greymoor's rural quiet. The city's energy felt both stimulating and overwhelming after a week of country life. I made my way to my rooms, finding everything as I'd left it, though dust had accumulated in my absence, and the air held the closed, stale quality of an unoccupied space. I opened windows to admit fresh air despite the cold, rebuilt the fire that had died to cold ashes, and began the process of settling back into my normal life. Yet something had changed, not in the external circumstances, but in my own understanding. The experiences at Greymoor had expanded my sense of what detection meant, what mysteries might lie hidden beneath ordinary surfaces, what responsibilities came with discovery and revelation. Over the following weeks, I wrote the account you've been hearing tonight, shaping raw experience into narrative, trying to capture both the external events and their internal significance. I consulted with Holmes on various details, particularly regarding how much to reveal about the chamber's specific contents. We agreed that the story should focus on the human elements, Edmund's discovery and near-fatal quest, the household's loyalty, the detective work leading to his rescue, while treating the historical materials more generally. The complete scholarly revelation of what Greymoor's chamber contained would unfold over decades, published through academic journals and specialized monographs, as authentication proceeded and appropriate context was established. That work continues still, engaging scholars across multiple disciplines, gradually revealing knowledge that had been preserved through centuries of patient guardianship. But that's a story for historians and archaeologists to tell. My tale concerns the more immediate human drama, a man's obsession with discovery, his sister's determination to find him, a household's loyalty, and the detective work that brought crisis to resolution. In the end, all stories are human stories, even when they touch on vast historical currents or ancient mysteries. We tell them to each other across centuries and continents, preserving memory, transmitting meaning, creating the continuity that makes civilization possible. Like the Templars, with their hidden sanctuaries, we are all guardians of something: knowledge, memory, values, hopes for future generations. The question is not whether to preserve and transmit, but how to do so wisely, with care for both accuracy and appropriate timing. These are deep thoughts for a winter evening, perhaps too heavy for the bedtime story I intended to provide. But as sleep finds you now, perhaps you can carry with you this sense of connection to long chains of human effort, this awareness that every generation receives gifts from those before and bears responsibility to those after. The snowstorm at the country estate brought drama and near tragedy, but also revelation and renewal. Edmund survived to continue his guardianship, now shared with others, and transformed from burden to purposeful collaboration. Lady Catherine found new direction for her considerable abilities, becoming administrator and advocate for scholarly work of genuine significance. The household that had served in quiet isolation now understood its role more fully and embraced it with renewed dedication. And I added another case to my chronicles, another chapter to the ongoing story of how Holmes and I navigate the mysteries that London and its surrounding countryside continually present. Some cases involve crimes and criminals, others touch on questions of history and knowledge. All teach something about human nature, about what drives us to both conceal and reveal, to preserve and destroy, to seek truth even when truth proves uncomfortable or dangerous. The fire in my London rooms burns low now as I complete this account, much as the fire at Greymore must be burning in that library where so much was discovered and so many questions first emerged. Winter continues its dominance, but beneath the frozen ground, spring prepares itself, waiting for the right moment to emerge. So too with knowledge, with truth, with all the things we hide in sanctuaries and chambers, preserving them until the time arrives for proper revelation. That time comes not at random, but through human choice, through the decisions of guardians who must balance preservation with revelation, secrecy with sharing. If you've stayed with me through this long tale, through all its twists and discoveries, through crisis and resolution, then I thank you for your patient attention. Stories require listeners as well as tellers. The telling and hearing together create the meaning that makes narrative worthwhile. I hope this tale has provided what I promised at its beginning, a mystery to engage your mind, descriptions to ease you toward rest, a journey through Victorian shadows and candlelit discoveries that carried you from your present moment into another time and place. If sleep has found you along the way, then the story succeeded in its primary purpose. If you remain awake to this final paragraph, then I thank you for your companionship through the narrative. Before I let you drift into whatever dreams await, I'd ask one small thing. If you enjoyed this journey to Greymore House and the mysteries we uncovered there, if my voice and Watson's chronicling provided the comfort and gentle intrigue you sought, please consider subscribing to this channel, leaving a like on this video, and letting me know in comments what other sorts of mysteries you'd enjoy exploring together in future nights. There are so many stories still to tell. Cases from Holmes's files, investigations Watson conducted independently, mysteries from before they met and after they parted. Each offers its own journey, its own gentle path towards sleep and peaceful rest. But for tonight, our tale is complete. The snowstorm has passed. Edmund is safe. The mysteries of Greymore's hidden chamber have been properly secured, and all is as well as circumstances allow. The household sleeps peacefully. The winter night holds no threats, and morning, when it comes, will bring new purposes and continuing revelation. And so, I bid you good night, dear listener, wherever you are, whatever time you're hearing these words. May your sleep be peaceful, your dreams gentle, and your rest restorative. May you wake refreshed, carrying perhaps some sense of the wonder and mystery we explored together. The awareness that beneath ordinary surfaces, extraordinary things sometimes wait to be discovered. Sleep well, dream deeply, and know that here in this quiet corner of the internet, stories await whenever you need them. Mysteries to intrigue, atmospheres to soothe, narratives to carry you from waking into peaceful rest. Until we meet again in another story, another mystery, another journey through Victorian shadows, and the eternal questions of human nature and purpose, I remain your faithful narrator, your guide through literary landscapes, your companion in the soft hours between day and night. Good night. Sleep peacefully, and may tomorrow bring whatever discoveries your own life requires. The fire has burned to embers now. The clock marks another hour's passage. And somewhere, always, another story waits to be told. Another mystery invites investigation. Another journey offers its particular gifts of discovery and wonder. But that's for another night. For now, simply rest. Good night.